Section 18 of Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Businessmen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Businessmen by Elbert Hubbard. Section 18, George Peabody. Part 2. The outdoor work of tramping Maryland and Virginia highways had put the glow of high health on the cheek of George Peabody. He was big in body, manly, intelligent, and could meet men on the basis of equality. If I were president of a college, I would certainly have a chair devoted to psychic mixability, or charm of manner. Ponderosity, profundity, and insipidity may have their place, but the man with charm of manner keeps his capital active. His soul is fluid. I have never been in possession of enough of this social radium to analyze it, but I know it has the power of dissolving opposition and melting human hearts. But so delicate and elusive is it that when used for a purely selfish purpose, it evaporates into thin air, and the erstwhile possessor is left with only the mask of beauty and the husk of a personality. George Peabody had charm of manner from his 19th year to the day of his death. Colonel Forney crossed the Atlantic with him when Peabody was in his 71st year, and here is what Forney says. "I sat on one side of the cabin, and he on the other. He was reading from a book, which he finally merely held in his hands as he sat idly dreaming. I was melted into tears by the sight of his Jove-like head framed against the window. His face and features beamed with high and noble intellect, and his eyes looked forth in divine love. If ever soul revealed itself in the face, it was here. He was the very king of men, and I did not at all wonder that in the past people had worked the apotheosis such as he." The firm of Riggs and Peabody prospered. It outgrew its quarters in Old Congress Hall in Georgetown, and ran over into a house next door, which it preempted. Moreover, it was apparent by this time that neither Georgetown nor Washington would ever be the commercial metropolis of America. The city of Baltimore had special harbor advantages that Washington did not have. The ships touched there according to natural law. And when Riggs and Peabody found themselves carting consignments to Baltimore in order to make shipment to Savannah and Charleston, they knew the die was cast. They packed up and moved to Baltimore. This was in the year 1815. In order to do business, you had better go where business is being done. Trade follows the lines of least resistance. The wholesale dealer saw the value of honesty as a business asset long before the retailer made the same unique discovery. Dr. Algernon S. Crapsey says that truth is a brand new virtue, and the clergy are not quite sure about it yet. To hold his trade, the jobber found he had to be on the dead level. He had to consider himself the attorney for his client. Peabody was a merchant by instinct. He had good taste, and he had a prophetic instinct as to what the people wanted. Instead of buying his supplies in Newburyport, Boston, and New York, he now established relations with London, direct. And London was then the commercial center of the world, the arbiter of fashion, the molder of form, the home of finance, frenzied and otherwise. Riggs and Peabody shipped American cotton to London, and received in return the manufactured production in its manifold forms. In 1829, Riggs withdrew from the firm, retaining a certain financial interest merely, and Peabody forged to the front alone as a financier. For many years, Peabody dealt largely with Robert Owen, and thus there grew up a close and lasting friendship between these very able men. Both were scouts for civilization. No doubt they influenced each other for good. We find them working out a new policy in business, the policy of reciprocity instead of exploitation. Robert Owen always had almost unlimited credit, for he prized his word as the immediate jewel of his soul. It was exactly the same with Peabody. In 1827, Peabody visited England. He was then 32 years old. The merchants from whom he bought discovered a surprising thing when they met Peabody. He was not the bounding, bragging, bustling, hustling American. He hustled, of course, but not visibly nor offensively. He had the appearance of a man who had all the time there was. He was moderate in voice and gentle in manner, and we hear of a London banker paying him the somewhat ambiguous compliment of saying, "Well, you know, he is a perfect gentleman. He does not seem like an American at all, you know." Peabody had the rare gift of never defeating his ends through haste and anxiety. The second trip Peabody made to London was in 1835, and it was on a very delicate and important errand. The state of Maryland was in sore financial distress. She had issued bonds, and these were coming due. Certain southern states had repudiated their debts, and it looked as if Maryland was going to default. Peabody issued an open letter calling on the citizens of Maryland to preserve their commercial honor. The state bonds were held mostly in New York and Philadelphia, and these were rival cities. Baltimore was to be taboo. Steve Girard had loaned money to Maryland, and in 1829 had declined to renew, and this, some said, had led to the stringency which reached its height in 1835. Then it was that the state of Maryland empowered George Peabody to go to London and negotiate a loan. The initiative was his own. He went to London and floated a loan of $8 million. Robert Owen said that Peabody borrowed the money on his face. He invited a dozen London bankers to a dinner, and when the cloth was removed, he explained the matter in such a lucid way that the moneybags loosened their strings and did his bidding without parley. Peabody sailed back to Baltimore with the gold coin. Another case of charm of manner. Peabody knew the loan was a good thing to both borrower and lender, and the man who knows what he is going to do with money, and when and how he is going to pay it back, is never at a loss for funds. In 1893, Andrew Carnegie called upon the banks of Pittsburgh for a $1 million loan. The bankers said, "Why, Mr. Carnegie, this is unprecedented." The reply was, "Well, I am a man who does unprecedented things. If you believe that I know what I am doing, get this money together for me. Life is too short for apologies. I'll be back in an hour." 3 of the bankers coughed, 1 sneezed, but they got the money and had it ready when Andy called in an hour. In this transaction, Andy held the whip hand. The Carnegie Mills were already owing the Pittsburgh banks a tidy $1 million or so, and they were compelled to uphold and support the credit of their clients, or run the risk of having smokestacks fall about their ears. It was so, in degree, with Peabody and the London bankers. A considerable portion of Maryland's old bond issue had been hypothecated by the Philadelphia and New York bankers with merchants in London. It was now Peabody's cue to show London that she must protect her own. His gracious presence and his logic saved the day. It is a great man who can flick a fly off the off-leader's ear when occasion demands. As a commission for securing the London loan, the state of Maryland gave Peabody a check for $60,000. He endorsed the check, presented to the state of Maryland with the best wishes of G. Peabody, and gave it back. Peabody's success with Threadneedle Street tapped for him a reservoir of power. To bring Great Britain and America into closer financial and industrial relationship now became his life work. In 1835 he moved his principal office to London. This was for the purpose of facilitating the shipment of English goods to America. The English manufacturers were afraid to sell to American merchants. "Capital is timid," said Adam Smith, the truth of which many of us can attest. Peabody knew the trade of America, and his business now was to make advances to English jobbers on shipments going to the States. Thus did he lubricate the wheels of trade. London bankers had been trying to show English manufacturers that trading with the American colonies was very risky, insomuch as these colonies were rebels, and entertained a hate and jealousy toward the mother country which might manifest itself in repudiation almost any time. This fanning of old embers was to keep up the rate of discount. The postage on a letter carried from England to America, or America to England, was 25 cents when Peabody first went to England. He saw the rate reduced to 10 cents, and this largely through his own efforts. Now we send a letter to Great Britain for 2 cents, or as cheaply as a letter can be sent from New York City to Yonkers. Through the influence of George Peabody, more than any other man of his time, the two great countries grew to understand each other. The business of Peabody was to maintain the credit of America. To this end, he made advances on shipments to the States. Where brokers had formerly charged 10%, he took 5%, and moreover, where he knew the American importer, he advanced to the full amount of the invoice. He turned his money over 4 times a year, and thus got an interest on it of 20%. his losses averaged only 1/2%. When he wanted funds, he found no difficulty in borrowing at a low rate of interest on his own paper. The business was simple, easy, and when once started, yielded an income to Peabody of from $300,000 to $500,000 a year. And no one was more surprised than George Peabody himself, who had once worked for a certain Sylvester Proctor of Danvers for 4 years, and at the end of that time had been paid $5 and given a suit of clothes. Peabody lived and died a bachelor. Bachelors are of two kinds. There is the rara avis other sort, and the common variety, known as the bachelorum vulgaris. The latter variety may always be recognized by his proclivity to trespass on the preserve of the Shah of Persia, thus laying the candidate open to a suit for the collection of royalties. Besides that, the bachelorum vulgaris is apt to fall into the poison ivy, lose his hair, teeth, charm, and digestion, and die at the top. The other sort is wedded to his work, for man is a molecule in the mass and must be wedded to something. To be wedded to your work is to live long and well. For a man to wed a woman who has no interest in his work, and thus live his life in an orbit outside of hers, often calls the party to oscillate into the course followed by the bachelorum vulgaris and the honorable Shah, known as the devil and the deep sea, and thus he completes the circle, revealing the law of antithesis, that the opposites of things are alike. The ideal condition is to be a bigamist and wed a woman and your work at the same time. To wed a woman and be weaned from your work is a tragedy. To wed your work and eliminate the woman may spell success. If compelled to choose, be loyal to your work. As specimens of those who got along fairly well without either a feminine helpmate or a sinker, I give you Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, Titian, Sir Isaac Newton, Herbert Spencer, and George Peabody. George Peabody was a true apostolic predecessor of Harry G. Selfridge of Chicago and the round world, who has inaugurated American manufacturing methods in London, selling to the swells of Piccadilly the smart suits created by Stein Bloch. Unlike most men of wealth and position, Peabody never assumed unusual importance nor demanded favors. In London, where he lived for 30 years, he resided in simple apartments, with no use for a valet nor the genus flunky. He was grateful to servants, courteous to porters, thankful to everybody, always patient, never complaining of inattention. He grew to be a favorite among the bus men who came to know him and sought to do him honor. The poor of London blessed him as he walked by, with reasons, probably, not wholly disinterested. He used no tobacco, never touched spirituous liquors, and at banquets usually partook of but a single dish. His first great gift was £3,000,000 to erect model tenements for the poor of London. The Peabody apartments occupy 2 squares in Islington and are worth a visit today, although they were built about 1850. The intent was to supply a home for working people that was sanitary, wholesome, and complete, at a rental of exact cost. Peabody expected that his example would be imitated by the rich men of the nobility, and that squalor and indigence would soon become things of the past. Alas, the Peabody apartments accommodate only about 1,000 people, and 500,000 or more of human beings live in abasing poverty and misery in London today. Except in a few instances, the nobility of London are devoid of the philanthropic spirit. In New York, the Mills hotels are yet curiosities, and the model tenements exist mostly on paper. Trinity Church, with its millions, draws an income today from property of a type which Peabody prophesied would not exist in the year 1900. One thing which Peabody did not bank on was the indifference of the poor to their surroundings, and the inherent taste for strong drink. He thought that if the rich would come to the rescue, the poor would welcome the new regime and be grateful. The truth seems to be that the poor must help themselves, and that beautiful as philanthropy is, it is mostly for the philanthropist. The poor must be educated to secrete their surroundings, otherwise if you supply them a palace, they will transform it into a slum tomorrow. The sole object of philanthropy, said Story the sculptor, is to model a face like George Peabody's. When the news reached America of what George Peabody, the American, was doing for London, there were many unkind remarks about his having forsaken his native land. To equalize matters, Peabody then gave $3,000,000, just what he had given to London, for the cause of education in the southern states. This money was used to establish schoolhouses. Wherever a town raised $500 for a school, Peabody would give a like sum. $1,000,000 of the Peabody Fund was finally used for a normal school at Nashville. The investment has proved a wise and beneficent one. He next gave $1.5 million to found the Peabody Institute of Baltimore. That this gift fired the heart of Peter Cooper to do a similar work, and if possible a better work, there is no doubt. At the first World's Fair held in London in 1851, Peabody gave $15,000 toward the exhibition of American inventions, the chief of which at this time were the McCormick Reaper, Eli Whitney's cotton gin, and Colt's revolver. Peabody backed Dr. Kane with a gift of $20,000 in his search for Franklin. He established various libraries, and gave $250,000 to his native town for a Peabody Institute. Danvers can yet be found on the map, but Peabody is a place of pilgrimage for those who reverence that American invention, a new virtue, the art of giving wisely. Joshua Bates, through whose generosity Boston secured her free library, was an agent of Peabody's, and afterwards his partner. Later, Bates became a member of the House of Baring Brothers, and carried on a business similar to that of George Peabody. There is no doubt that Bates got his philanthropic impulse from Peabody. In 1856, Peabody visited his native town of Danvers after an absence of more than 40 years. They were great doings in which all the school children, as well as the governor of the state, had a part. At Washington, Peabody was the guest of the president. The House of Representatives and the Senate adjourned their regular business to do him honor, and he made an address to them. The judges of the Supreme Court invited him to sit on the bench when he entered their chamber. For 20 years he was America's unofficial chief representative in London, no matter who was consul or who ambassador. Every year, on July 4th, he gave a dinner to the principal Americans who happened to be in London. To be invited to this dinner was an event. Peabody himself always presided, and there was considerable oratory, sometimes of the brand known as Southwestern, which Peabody tolerated with gentle smiles. On one occasion, however, things did not go smoothly. Daniel Sickles was consul to London, and James Buchanan, afterwards our punkish president, was ambassador. Sickles was a good man, but a fire-eater, and a gentleman of marked jingo proclivities. Sickles had asked that Buchanan preside, in which case Buchanan was to call on Sickles for the first toast, and this toast was to be, the President of the United States. At the same time, Sickles intended to give the British lion's tail a few gratuitous twists. Peabody declined to accede to Sickles' wish, but he himself presided, and offered the first to the Queen of England. Thereupon Sickles walked out with needless clatter, and Buchanan sat glued to his seat. The affair came near being an international episode. Peabody was always an American, and better, he was a citizen of the world. He loved America, but when on English soil, really guest of England, he gave the Queen the place of honor. This seems to us proper and right, and at this distance we smile at the whole transaction, but we are glad that Peabody, who paid for the dinner, had his way as to the oratorical guff. The Queen offered Peabody a knighthood, but he declined, saying, "If Her Majesty write me a personal letter endorsing my desire to help the poor of London, I will be more than delighted." Victoria then wrote the letter, and she also had a picture of herself painted in miniature and gave it to him. The letter and portrait are now in the Peabody Institute at Peabody, Massachusetts. When Peabody died in 1869, Queen Victoria ordered that his body be placed in Westminster Abbey. The Queen in person attended the funeral, the flags on Parliament House were lowered to half-mast, and the body was attended to Westminster Abbey by the Royal Guard. Gladstone was one of the pall-bearers. Later, it was discovered that Peabody had devised in his will that his body should rest by the side of his father and mother in Harmony Grove, the village cemetery at Danvers, and in the spot over which his boyish feet had trod. The body was then removed from the abbey and placed on board the British man-of-war Monarch in the presence of the Prime Minister, the Secretary of Foreign Affairs, and many distinguished citizens. The Monarch was conveyed to America by a French and an American gunboat. No such honors were ever before paid to the memory of a simple American citizen. Well did the Reverend Newman Hall say, in his funeral oration, "George Peabody waged a war against want and woe. He created homes, he never desolated one. He sided with the friendless and the houseless, and his life was guided by a law of love which none could ever wish to repeal. His was the task of cementing the hearts of Britain and America, pointing both to their duty to God and to mankind." End of section 18. Recording by Todd.
Section 19 of Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Businessmen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Availle in December 2020. Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Businessmen by Elbert Hubbard. Chapter 10. A.T. Stewart. The merchant of the future will not only be an economist and an industrial leader, he will also be a teacher and a humanitarian. A.T. Stewart in a letter to President Grant. When His Excellency Wu Ting Fang was asked what country he would live in if he had his choice, his unhesitating answer was Ireland. The reply brought forth another question, as His secretive and clever Excellency knew it would, namely, why? Because Ireland is the only country in the world in which the Irish have no influence. Also, it might be stated, although it has nothing to do with the case, that the Jews are very much more influential in New York City than they are in Jerusalem. The Turk is to Palestine what the English are to Ireland. The human product has to be transplanted in order to get the best results, just as the finest roses of California are slipped near Powers Four Corners, Rochester, Monroe County, New York, and are then shipped to the West. A new environment means, often, spiritual power before unguessed. The struggle of the man to fit himself into a new condition, and thus harmonize with his surroundings, brings out his latent energies and discovers for him untapped reservoirs. It was Edmund Burke who said, "The Irish are all right, but you must catch them young." When England wants a superbly strong man, she has to send to Ireland for him. Note Burke, her greatest orator; Swift, her greatest satirist; Goldsmith, her sweetest poet; Arthur Wellesley, her greatest fighter, not to mention Lord Bobs, all awfully Irish. And to America comes Alexander Turney Stewart, aged 20, very Irish, shy, pink, blue of eye, with downy whiskers, intending to teach school until he could prepare himself for the ministry. It was the year 1820, and at that time the stars of the Irish schoolmaster were in the ascendant. For a space of 40 years, say from 1805 to 1845, 80% of all graduates of Trinity College, Dublin, came straight to America and found situations awaiting them. Young Stewart had been at Trinity College 2 years, when by the death of his grandfather he found himself without funds. His father died when he was 3 years old, and his grandparents took him in charge. His mother, it seems, married again, and was busy raising a goodly brood of Callahans, several of whom in after years came to New York and were given jobs at the A.T. Stewart button counter. Young Stewart could have borrowed money to keep him in college, for he knew that when he was 21 he would come into an inheritance from his father's estate. However, on an impulse, he just sold his books, pawned his watch, and bought passage for America, the land of promise. The boy had the look of a scholar, and he had dignity, as shy folks often have. Also, he had a Trinity College brogue, a thing quite as desirable as a Trinity College degree. Later, A.T. Stewart lost his brogue, but Trinity College sent him all the degrees she had, including the LL.D., which arrived on his 70th birthday. The Irish built our railroads, but Paddy no longer works on the section. He owns the railroad. Note the Harrimans, the Hanrahans, the McCrees, the McDougals, the O'Donnells, the O'Days, the Hills, all just one generation removed from the bog, and the smell of peat smoke still upon them. The Irish schoolmasters glided easily from taking charge of the school into taking charge of our municipal affairs, for a consideration, and their younger brothers, their cousins, their uncles, and their aunts found jobs yawning for them as soon as they had pushed past the gates of Castle Garden. 1 year of school teaching in New York City, and A.T. Stewart reached his majority. He had saved just $200 of his salary, and he sailed away, back to old Ireland, a successful man. Now he would go back to Trinity and complete his course, and be glorified. He had proved his ability to meet the world on a fair footing and take care of himself. All of which speaks well for young Mr. Stewart, and it also speaks well for his grandparents, who had brought him up in a good, sensible way to work, economize, and keep a civil tongue in his Irish head. His grandfather didn't exactly belong to the gentry. It was better than that. He was an Irish clerk who had become a scrivener and then risen to a professorship. A.T. Stewart was heir to a goodly amount of decent pride, which always kept him in the society of educated people, and made him walk with the crown of his head high and his chin in. He thought well of himself, and the world is very apt to take a man at his own estimate. A year in the States had transformed the young man from a greenhorn into a gentleman. The climate of the West had agreed with him. He himself told how on going back to Belfast, the city seemed to have grown smaller and very quiet. He compared everything to Broadway, and smiled at a jaunting car compared to a bus. When he went to Trinity College and saw his class, from whom he had parted only a year before, all thought of remaining 2 years to graduate faded from his mind. An ocean seemed to divide him from both teachers and pupils. The professors were stupid and slow. The pupils were boys. He was a man. They too felt the difference and called him Sir. And when one of them introduced him to a freshman as an American, Freshie bowed low, and the breast of A.T. Stewart expanded with pride. Not even the offer of a professorship could have kept him in Ireland. He saw himself the principal of an American college, filling the pulpit of the college chapel on Sunday, picturing the fate of the unrenegade in fiery accents. The Yankee atmosphere had made him a bit heady. The legacy left him by his grandfather was exactly £1,000, $5,000. What to do with this money he did not know. Anyway, he would take it to America and wisely invest it. In New York he had boarded with an Irish family, the head of which was a draper. This man had a small store on West Street, and Alexander had helped tend store on Saturdays, and occasionally evenings, when ships came in, and sailors with money to waste lumbered and lubbered past, often with gay painted galleys in tow. The things you do at 20 are making indelible marks on your character. Stewart had no special taste for trade, but experience spells power, potential or actual. With $5,000 in his belt, all in gold, he felt uncomfortable. And so, on a venture, he expended half of it in good Irish lace, insertions and scallop trimmings. Irish linens, Irish poplins, and Irish lace were being shipped to New York. It could not be a loss. He would follow suit. If he was robbed of his money, he could not at the same time be robbed of the drapery. And so he sailed away for New York, and Ireland looked more green and more beautiful as the great, uplifting green hills faded from sight and were lost to view in the mist. On the ship that carried Stewart back to New York was a young man who professed to be an adept in the draper's line. Very naturally, Stewart got acquainted with this man and told him of his investment in dry goods. The man offered to sell the stock for Stewart. In those days the Irish peddler with his pack full of curious and wonderful things was a common sight at the farmhouses. He rivaled both Yankee Gentile and Jew, and his blarney was a commodity that stood him in good stead. Stewart's new-found friend promised to sell the stock in short order by going right out among the people. He had no money of his own, and Stewart was doubly pleased to think he could set a worthy man up in business and help himself at the same time. On reaching New York, the friend was fitted out with all the goods he could carry, and duly headed for New Jersey. In 2 days he came back. He had sold most of the goods all right, and with the money gotten gloriously drunk. Also, he had bought drinks for all the Irishmen he could find, and naturally they were many. Stewart even then did not give up the case. He rented a small store at 283 Broadway, and decided that by staying close to his friend he could keep him in the straight and narrow path of probity. As for himself, he would teach school as usual, and he and his agent could use the back of the little store for a sleeping room. It was a week before his school was to begin, but in that week he became convinced that his friend was not a merchant, and to get that first month's rent he would have to run the store himself. So he put the disciple of Bacchus on the slide and started in alone. Stewart had a little inconvenient pride which prevented his turning peddler. Instead of going to the world, he would bring the world to him. With this end, therefore, in view, the New York Daily Advertiser for September 2nd, 1825, contained this notice: A.T. Stewart, just arrived from Belfast, offers for sale to the ladies of New York a choice selection of fresh dry goods at 283 Broadway. The advertisement was a good one, the proof of which was that many Puffick ladies called to see the stock, and the man just arrived from Belfast. Stewart was a wise advertiser. His use of the word ladies showed good psychology. The young merchant hadn't much more than taken down his shutters before a lady entered the store and acknowledged she was one. She lived in the next block, and as soon as she read the advertisement in the paper, yet damp from the press, she came right over. Stewart spread out his wares with shaking hands. He must make a sale to his first caller, or he would never have luck. The lady bought scallops and lace to the extent of $2, on Stewart's throwing her in gratis sundry yards of braid, a card of buttons, and a paper of hooks and eyes. The woman paid the money, and A.T. Stewart was launched, then and there, on a career. He was a handsome young fellow, intelligent and never too familiar, but just familiar enough. Women liked him. He was so respectful, almost reverent, in his attitude toward them. It took a better man to be a salesman then than now. Every article was marked in cipher, with 2 prices. One figure represented what the thing cost, and the other was the selling price. You secured the selling price if you could, and if you couldn't, you took what you could get, right down to the cost figure. The motto was, never let a customer go without selling him something. The rule now is to sell people what they want, but never urge anyone to buy. Both buyer and seller then enjoyed these fencing bouts of the bazaar. The time for simple dealing between man and man had not yet come. To haggle, banter, and blarney were parts of the game, and parts which the buyer demanded as his right. He would trade only at places where he thought he was getting the start of the dealer, and where his cleverness had an opportunity for exercise. The thought of getting something for nothing was in the air, and to get the better of somebody was regarded as proper and right. Had a retail dealer then advertised one price and no deviation to anyone, the customers would surely have given him absent treatment. The verbal fencing, the forays of wit, the clash of accusation, and the final forlorn sigh of surrender of the seller were things which the buyer demanded as his, or more properly, her, right. Often these encounters attracted interested bystanders, who saw the skilful buyer berate the seller and run down his goods, until the poor man, abject and undone, gave up. To get the better of the mailman and force him to his knees is the pleasant diversion of a certain type of feminine mind. Before marriage, the woman always, I am told, takes this high-handed attitude. Perhaps she dimly realizes that her time for tyranny is short. To make the man a suppliant is the delight of her soul. After marriage, the positions are reversed. But in the good old days, most women, not absolutely desiccated by age or ironed out by life's vicissitudes, found a sort of secondary sexual delight in these shopping assaults on the gentlemanly party on the other side of the counter. We have all seen women enter into heated arguments and indulge in a half-quarrel with attractive men about nothing. If the man is wise, he allows the woman to force him into a corner, where he yields with a grace, ill-concealed, and thus is he victor without the ladies knowing it. This is a sort of salesmanship that Sheldon knows nothing of, and that, happily, is for the most part not yet obsolete. A.T. Stewart was a natural salesman of the old school. He was a success from the very start. He was tall, he had good teeth, a handsome face, a graceful form, and dressed with exquisite care. The personal charm of manner was his chief asset. And while business then was barter, and the methods of booth and bazaar prevailed, Stewart was wise enough never to take advantage of a customer regarding either price or quality. If the buyer held off long enough, she might buy very close to cost, but if she bought quickly and at Stewart's figures, he had a way of throwing in a yard of ribbon or elastic, or a spool or two of thread, all unasked for, that equalized the transaction. He seems to have been the very first man in trade to realize that to hold your trade you must make a friend of the customer. In a year he had outgrown the little store at 283 Broadway, and he moved to a larger place at 262 Broadway. Then came a new store, built for him by a worthy real estate owner, John Jacob Astor by name. This store was 30 feet wide, 100 feet deep, and 3 stories high, with a basement. It was a genuine dry goods store. It had a ladies' parlor on the 2nd floor, and a dressing room with full-length mirrors ordered from Paris. They were the first full-length mirrors in America, and A.T. Stewart issued a special invitation to the ladies of New York to come and see them, and see themselves as others saw them. To arrange these mirrors so that a lady could see the buttons on the back of her dress was regarded as the final achievement of legerdemain. The A.T. Stewart store was a woman's store. In hiring salesmen, the owner picked only gentlemen of presence. The floor-walker had his rise in A.T. Stewart. Once a woman asked a floor-walker this question, "Do you keep stationery?" And the answer was, "If I did, I'd never draw my salary." This is a silly story, and if it ever happened, it did not transpire at A.T. Stewart's. There the floor-walker was always as a cow that is being milked. For the first 15 years of his career, Stewart made it a rule to meet and greet every customer, personally. The floor-walker, or the head usher as he was called, was either the proprietor or his personal representative. Stewart never offered to shake hands with a customer, no matter how well he knew the lady, but bowed low, and with becoming gravity and gentle voice inquired her wishes. He then conducted her to the counter where the goods she wanted were kept. As the clerk would take down his goods, Stewart had a way of reproving the man thus: "Not that, Mr. Johnson, not that. You seem to forget whom you are waiting on." When the lady left, Stewart accompanied her to the door. He wore a long beard, shaved his upper lip, and looked like a Presbyterian clergyman making pastoral calls. Silks, dress goods, and laces gradually grew to be the A.T. Stewart specialties. That the man had taste and never ran stripes around a stout lady, or made a very slim one look more so, is a matter of history. "I have been hoping you would come, for we have a piece of silk that seems to have been made for you. I ordered it put aside until you could see it. Mr. Johnson, that silk pattern, please, that I told you not to show to anyone until Mrs. Breford called. Thank you, yes, that is the one." Then there were ways of saying, "Oh, Mr. Johnson, you remember the duplicate of that silk dress pattern which was made for Queen Victoria? I think Mrs. Astor would like to examine it." Thus was compliment fused with commerce and made to yield a dividend. The prevailing methods in trade are always keyed by the public. The merchant is part of the public, he ministers to the public. A public that demands a high degree of honesty and unselfish service will get it. Sharp practice and double dealing among the people find an outcrop in public affairs. Rogues in a community will have no trouble in finding rogue lawyers to do their bidding. In fact, rogue clients evolve rogue attorneys. Foolish patients evolve fool doctors. And superstition and silliness in the pew find a fitting expression in the pulpit. The first man in New York to work the cost-sale scheme was A.T. Stewart. In 1830 he advertised, "Mr. A.T. Stewart, having purchased a large amount of goods soon to arrive, is obliged, in order to make room for these, to dispose of all the stock he has on hand, which will be sold at actual cost, beginning Monday at 8 a.m. Ladies are requested to come early and avoid the crush." At another time he advertised, "A.T. Stewart is obliged to raise a large amount of money to pay for silks and dress goods that are now being made for him in Europe. To secure this money he is obliged to hold a cost sale of everything in his store. The sale will begin Friday at noon and end at midnight on Saturday the day after." Stewart also had fire sales, although it speaks well for himself that he never had a fire in his own store. If others had fires, he was on hand to buy the salvage, and whether he bought it or not, he managed to have a fire sale. He loved the smoke of commercial rhetoric and the excitement of seeing the crowd. This applies more particularly to the first 20 years of his career. During those first years he used to have a way of opening cases on the sidewalk and selling from the case to the first person who made an offer. This brought him good luck, especially if the person had cross eyes or was a hunchback. The messy clutter in front of the store and the pushing crowds advertised the business. Finally, a competitor next door complained to the police about Stewart's blocking the sidewalk. The police interfered, and Stewart was given 1 day to clear off the walk. At once he put up a big sign. "Our neighbors to the right, not being able to compete with us, demand that we shall open no more goods on the sidewalk. To make room we are obliged to have a cost sale. You buy your goods, pay for them, and carry them away. We can't even afford to pay for wrapping paper and string." All this tended to keep the town awake, and the old Irish adage of "where McGinty sits is the head of the table" became true of A.T. Stewart. His store was the center of trade. When he moved, the trade moved with him. To all charitable objects he gave liberally. He gave to all churches, and was recognized as a sort of clergyman himself, and in his dress he managed to look the part. The 10% off to clergymen and school teachers was his innovation. This 10% was supposed to be his profit, but 40% would have been nearer it. Of course, the same discount had to be given to any member of a clergyman's or a teacher's family. And so we hear of one of Stewart's cashiers saying, "Over half of the people in New York are clergymen or teachers." The temptation to pass oneself off for a clergyman at Stewart's store was a bait that had no lure when you visited Girard College. All this was but a part and parcel of the times, an index of the zeitgeist. A.T. Stewart was alive, alert, and sensitive to the spirit of the times. He kept abreast with the best thought of the best people. The idea of opening boxes and bales on the sidewalk was abandoned early in the game, and the endeavor was to show the fabric only under the most favorable conditions. Stewart was reaching out for a higher clientele. The motto became, not how cheap, but how good. If A.T. Stewart sold goods at an average profit of, say, 30%, he could well afford to sell a small portion of his stock at cost, or even at 10% below cost. He knew his stocks, and he made it a point never to carry goods over from one year to another. Before he held one of his famous cost sales, he would personally work all night, taking down from the shelves and out of drawers and showcases everything in the store. Then he himself would dictate what each article should be sold for. Here was exercise for a mind that worked by intuition. The master decided instantly on how much this thing would bring. In railroad managing, there are two ways of making rates. One is the carefully figured-out cost of transportation. The other plan is to make a rate that will move the tonnage. A regular passenger rate is the rate that will afford a profit. An excursion rate, a home-seeker's rate, an old-home rate is the one that experience shows is necessary to tempt people to travel. Dry goods deteriorate in quality when kept on the shelves for several months. Worse than that, they cease to attract the buyers. People go where there is life, activity, and are moved by that which is youthful, new, and fresh. Old stocks become dead stocks, and dead stocks mean dead business and dead men, or bankruptcy. When it came to selling old stocks, Stewart paid no attention to the cost. He marked the tag in big, plain figures in red ink at the price he thought would move the goods. And usually he was right. We hear of his marking a piece of dress goods 49 cents a yard. A department manager came in and in alarm explained that the goods cost 53. "That has nothing to do with the case," replied Stewart. "We would not buy it today at 53, and we do not want the stuff on our shelves even at 49. "But," said the manager, "this is a cost sale, and if we sell below cost, we should explain that fact to our customers." And the answer was, "Young man, you must tell the customer only what she will believe. The actual truth is for ourselves." Stewart worked for an average of profit, and this he secured. His receipts mounted steadily year by year, until in 1850 they were $10,000 a day. And when he moved into his business palace at Astor Place, 10th Street and Broadway, the sales jumped to an average of over $50,000 a day. When A.T. Stewart built his business palace in 1865, it was the noblest business structure in America. Much of the iron used in it was supplied by Peter Cooper, and that worthy man was also consulted as to the plans. Just a square away from Stewart's business palace stands Cooper Union. In selecting this location, A.T. Stewart was influenced largely by the fact that it was so near to that center of art and education which Peter Cooper had made worldwide in fame. Stewart said, "My store shall vie with your museum, and people will throng it as they do an exposition." And this prophecy proved true. At his death in 1876, Stewart was the richest man in New York, save an Astor and a Vanderbilt, and these had inherited their wealth made through the rise of real estate, while Stewart had made his money in legitimate trade. A.T. Stewart was worth $40 million. The vast estate was mostly frittered away, honeycombed and moth-eaten by hungry attorneys. The business was carried on by Hessians who worked both ends against the middle and let the estate foot the deficits. A.T. Stewart had a genius for trade, but he had no gift for giving. The world needs a school for millionaires, so that, since they cannot take their millions with them, they can learn to leave their money wisely and well. After an up and down, mostly down, career of a decade, the business palace was bought by John Wanamaker. Again, and almost instantly, the business palace became a center of light and education, and the splendid aisles that a generation before had known the tread of the best people of Manhattan again felt their step. When Stewart built the business palace, people said, "Oh, it's too far uptown, nobody will go there." But they were wrong. When John Wanamaker moved in, many said, "Oh, it's beautiful, but you know it is too far downtown, nobody will go there." And these were as wrong as the first. Where McGinty sits is the head of the table. The trade siphoned itself thither under the magic name of Wanamaker, as though the shade of A.T. Stewart had been summoned from its confines in the Isles of Death. In Stewart's day no sign had been placed on the building. He said, "Everybody will know it's A.T. Stewart's." And they did. After his death, the place was plastered with signs that called in throaty falsetto at the passer-by, like eager salesmen on the Midway who try to entice people to enter. The new management took all these signs down, and by the main entrance placed a modest tablet carrying this inscription: "John Wanamaker, successor to A.T. Stewart." It was a comment so subtle that it took New York a year to awaken to its flavor of tincture of iron. That little sign reminds one of how Disraeli was once dining with an American and 2 other Englishmen. In the course of the conversation, the American proudly let slip the information that he traced a pedigree to parents who came to America in the Mayflower. One of the Englishmen here coughed and vouchsafed the fact that he traced the lineage to Oliver Cromwell. A little pause followed, and the other guest spat, muzzled his modesty, and said he traced to William the Conqueror. Disraeli, with great deliberation, made a hieroglyphic on the tablecloth with his fork, and said, "And I trace a pedigree to Moses, who walked and talked with God on Mount Sinai, 15 centuries before the birth of Christ." John Wanamaker leaped the gulf of 20 years and traced direct to A.T. Stewart, as well he might, for it was Stewart's achievement that had first fired his imagination to do and become. A.T. Stewart was the greatest merchant of his time. And John Wanamaker has been not only a great merchant, but a teacher of merchants. And the John Wanamaker stores now form a high school of economic industrialism. John Wanamaker is still teaching, tapping new reservoirs of power as the swift-changing seasons passed. As a preacher and a teacher, he has surely surpassed the versatile Stewart. To succeed in business today, it is not enough that you should look out for number 1. You must also look out for number 2. That is, you must consider the needs of the buyer and make his interests your own. To sell a person something he does not want, or to sell him something at a price above its actual value, is a calamity for the seller. Business is built on confidence. We make our money out of our friends. Our enemies will not trade with us. In law, the buyer and the seller are supposed to be people with equal opportunity to judge of an article and pass on its value. Hence there is a legal maxim, caveat emptor, let the buyer beware, and this provides that when an article is once purchased and passes into the possession of the buyer, it is his, and he has no redress for short weight, count, or inferior quality. Behind that legal Latin maxim, caveat emptor, the merchant stood for centuries safely entrenched. It was about 1865 that it came to John Wanamaker, a young merchant just starting business in Philadelphia, that the law is wrong in assuming that buyer and seller stand on a parity and have an equal opportunity for judging values. The dealer is a specialist, while the buyer, being a consumer of a great number of different things, has only a general knowledge, at best. The person with only a general idea as to values, pitted against the trained specialist, is at a great disadvantage. Therefore, to be on ethical ground, the seller must be the friend of the buyer, not his antagonist. For a seller to regard the buyer as his prey is worse than non-ethical. It is immoral, a violation of the golden rule. These things came to the young man, John Wanamaker, with a great throb and thrill, and he at once proceeded to put his theories into execution, and on them his business was founded. The one-price system, all goods marked in plain figures, and money back if not satisfied, these things were to revolutionize the retail trade of the world. John Wanamaker, of all men in America, seems to know that to stand still is to retreat. For more than 40 years he has led the vanguard of the business world. He has been a teacher of merchants. His insight, initiative, originality, and prophetic judgment have set the retailers of the world apace. Many have learned much from him, and all have been influenced by him. Whether they knew it or not, and whether they would acknowledge it if they did know it, matters little. Professor Zublin once said of William Morris, "There is not a well-furnished house in Christendom but that shows the influence of his good taste and his gracious ideas of economy, harmony, and honesty in home decoration." Likewise, we can truthfully say that there is not a successful retail store in America that does not show the influence of A.T. Stewart and his legitimate successor, John Wanamaker. End of section 19.
Section 20 of Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Businessmen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michele Eaton. Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Businessmen by Elbert Hubbard. Chapter 11, Part 1. H. H. Rogers. Success is rooted in reciprocity. He who does not benefit the world is headed for bankruptcy on the high-speed clutch. H. H. Rogers. One proof that H. H. Rogers was a personage and not a person lies in the fact that he was seldom mentioned in moderate language. Lawson passed him a few choice tributes. Ida Tarbell tarred him with her literary stick. Upton Sinclair declared he was this and that. Professor Heron averred that he bore no likeness whatever to Leo Tolstoy, and he might also have added, neither did he resemble Francis of Assisi or Simeon Stylites. Those who did not like him usually pictured him by recounting what he was not. My endeavour in this sketch will be simply to tell what he was. Henry Huddleston Rogers was a very human individual. He was born in the village of Fairhaven, Massachusetts, in the year 1840. He died in New York City in 1909, in his 70th year. He was the typical American, and his career was the ideal one to which we are always pointing our growing youth. His fault, if fault it may be, was that he succeeded too well. Success is a hard thing to forgive. Personality repels as well as attracts. The life of H. Rogers was the complete American romance. He lived the part and he looked it. He did not require a make-up. The subcortex was not for him, and even the liars never dared to say he was a hypocrite. H. Rogers had personality. Men turned to gaze at him on the street. Women glanced and then hastily looked unnecessarily hard the other way. Children stared. The man was tall, lithe, strong, graceful, commanding. His jaw was the jaw of courage. His chin meant purpose. His nose symboled intellect, poise and power. His brow spelled brain. He was a handsome man, and he was not wholly unaware of the fact. In him was the pride of the North American Indian, and a little of the reserve of the savage. His silence was always eloquent, and in it was neither stupidity nor vacuity. With friends he was witty, affable, generous, lovable. In business negotiation he was rapid, direct, incisive, or smooth, plausible and convincing, all depending upon the man with whom he was dealing. He often did to others what they were trying to do to him, and he did it first. He had the splendid ability to say no when he should, a thing many good men cannot do. At such times his mouth would shut like a steel trap, and his blue eyes would send the thermometer below zero. No one could play horse with H. Rogers. He himself was always in the saddle. The power of the man was more manifest with men than with women, yet he was always admired by women, but more on account of his austerity than his effort to please. He was not given to flattery, yet he was quick to commend. He had in him something of the dash that existed when knighthood was in flower. To the great of the earth H. Rogers never bowed the knee. He never shunned an encounter, save with weakness, greed and stupidity. He met every difficulty, every obstacle, unafraid and unabashed. Even death to him was only a passing event. Death for him had no sting, nor the grave a victory. He prepared for his passing, looking after every detail, as he had planned trips to Europe. Jauntily, jokingly, bravely, tremendously busy, keenly alive to beauty and friendship, deciding great issues off-hand, facing friend or foe. The moments of relaxation chinked in with religious emotion and a glowing love for humanity. So he lived and so he died. An executive has been described as a man who decides quickly and is sometimes right. H. Rogers was the ideal executive. He did not decide until the evidence was all in. He listened, weighed, sifted, sorted, and then decided. And when his decision was made, the case was closed. Big men who are doing big things that have never been done before act on this basis, otherwise they would be ironed out to the average, and their dreams would evaporate like the morning mist. The one thing about the dreams of H. Rogers is that he made them come true. "Give me neither poverty nor riches," said the philosopher. The parents of H. Rogers were neither rich nor poor. They had enough, but there was never a surfeit. They were of straight New England stock. Of his 4 great-grandfathers, 3 fought in the Revolutionary War. According to Thomas Carlyle, respectable people were those who kept a gig. In some towns The credential is that the family shall employ a hired girl. In Fairhaven the condition was that you should have a washerwoman 1 day in the week. The soapy wash water was saved for scrubbing purposes. This was in Massachusetts, and if the man of the house occasionally smoked a pipe, he was requested to blow the smoke on the plants in the south windows, so as to kill the vermin. Nothing was wasted. The child born into such a family, where industry and economy are prized, unless he is a mental defective and a physical cripple, will be sure to thrive. The father had made 1 trip in a whaler. He was gone 3 years and got a 147th part of the catch. The oil market was on a slump, and so the net result for the father of a millionaire-to-be was $95.20. This happy father was a grocer, and later a clerk to a broker in whale oil. Pater had the New England virtues to such a degree that they kept him poor. He was cautious plus. To make you have to spend. To grow a crop you have to plant the seed. Here's where you plunge. It is a gamble, a bet on the seed versus the eternal cussedness of things. It's you against the chances of a crop. If the drought comes, or the flood, or the chinch bug, or the brown-tailed moth, you may find yourself floundering in the Mulligatawny. Aside from that 1 cruise to the whaling grounds, Rogers père played the game of life near home and close to shore. The easy ways of the villagers are shown by a story Mr. Rogers used to tell about a good neighbour of his, a second mate on a whaler. The bark was weighing anchor and about to sail. The worthy mate tarried at a bar-room over in New Bedford. "Ain't you going home to kiss your wife good-bye?" someone asked. And the answer was, "What's the use? I'm only going to be gone 2 years." Half of Fairhaven was made up of fishermen, and the rest were widows and the usual village contingent. The widows were the washerwomen. Those who had the price hired a washerwoman 1 day in the week. This was not so much because the mother herself could not do the work, as it was to give work to the needy, and prove the Jeffersonian idea of equality. The wash lady was always seated with the family at table, and besides her wage was presented with a pie, a pumpkin, or some outgrown garment. Thus were the Christian virtues liberated. Where the grey mare is the better horse, her mate always lets up a bit on his whiffletree, and she draws most of the load. It was so here. The mother planned for the household. She was the economist, burser and disburser. She was a member of the Congregational Church, with a liberal bias, which believed in endless consequences, but not in endless punishment. Later the family evolved into Unitarians by the easy process of natural selection. The father said grace and the mother led in family prayers. She had ideas of her own and expressed them. The family took the Boston Weekly Congregationalist and the Bedford Weekly Standard. In the household there was a bookcase of nearly 100 volumes. It was the most complete library in town, with the exception of that of the minister. The house where H. Rogers was born still stands. Its frame was made in 1690, mortised, tenoned and pinned. In the garret the rafters show the loving marks of the broadaxe. To swing which musical instrument with grace and effectiveness is now a lost art. How short is the life of man! Here a babe was born who lived his infancy, youth, manhood, who achieved as 1 in a million, who died, yet the house of his birth, old at the time, still stubbornly stands as if to make mock of our ambitions. 100 years ago Fairhaven had a dozen men or more who with an auger, an adze, a broadaxe and a draw shave could build a boat or a house warranted to outlast the owner. I had tea in this house where H. Rogers was born and where his boyhood days were spent. I fetched an armful of wood for the housewife, and would have brought a bucket of water for her from the pump, only the pump is now out of commission. having been replaced by the newfangled waterworks presented to the town by a Standard Oil magnate. Here Henry Rogers brought chips in a wheelbarrow from the shipyard on baking days. Here he hoed the garden and helped his mother fasten up the flaming, flaring hollyhocks against the house with strips of old sailcloth and tacks. There were errands to look after, and usually a pig, and sometimes two, that accumulated à dispose on Purslane and Lamb's Quarters, with surplus clams for dessert. Also quayhogs to preserve the poetic unities. Then there came a time when the family kept a cow, which was pastured on the common, the herd being looked after by a man who had fought valiantly in the War of 1812, and who used to tell the boys about it, fighting the battles over with crutch and cane. In the winter the ice sometimes froze solid clean across Buzzard's Bay. The active and hustling boys had skates made by the village blacksmith. Henry Rogers had 2 pair, and used to loan 1 pair out for 2 cents an hour. Boys who had no skates and could not beg or borrow, and who had not but 1 cent, could sometimes get 1 skate for a while, and thus glide gracefully on 1 foot. There was good fishing through the ice, only it was awful cold work and not much pay, for fish could hardly be given away. In the summer there were clams to dig, blueberries to gather, and pond lilies had a value. I guess so. Then in the early spring folks raked up their yards and made bonfires of the winter debris. Henry Rogers did these odd jobs, and religiously took his money home to his mother, who placed it in the upper right-hand corner of a bureau drawer. The village school was kept by an Irishman who had attended Harvard. He believed in the classics and the efficacy of the ferule, and doted on Latin, which he also used as a punishment. Henry Rogers was alive and alert, and was diplomatic enough to manage the Milesian pedagogue without his ever knowing it. The lessons were easy to him, he absorbed in the mass. Besides that, his mother helped nights by the light of a whale oil lamp, for her boy was going to grow up to be a school teacher, or possibly a minister, who knows. Out in Illinois, when the Wanderlust used to catch the evolving youth, who was neither a boy nor a man, he ran away and went out west. In New England, the same lad would have shipped before the mast, and let his parents guess where he was, their due punishment for lack of appreciation. To grow up on the coast and hear the tales of the seafaring men who have gone down to the sea in ships is to catch it sooner or later. At 15 Henry Rogers caught it, and was duly recorded to go on a whaler. Luckily his mother got word of it, and cancelled the deal. About then, good fortune arrived in the form of opportunity. The young man who peddled the New Bedford Standard wanted to dispose of his route. Henry bought the route and advised with his mother afterward, only to find that she had sent the seller to him. Honours were even. His business was to deliver the papers with precision. Later he took on the Boston papers also. This is what gave rise to the story that Henry Rogers was a newsboy. He was a newsboy, but he was a newsboy extraordinary. He took orders for advertisements for the Standard, and was also the Fairhaven correspondent, supplying the news as to who was visiting whom, giving names of good citizens who were shingling their chicken houses, and mentioning those enjoying poor health. Whether the news did anybody any good or not matters little. The boy was learning to write. In after years he used to refer to this period of his life as his newspaper career. Superstitious persons have been agitated about that word Standard, and how it should have ominously come into the life of H. Rogers at this early time. When the railroad came in, Henry got a job as assistant baggageman. The conductorship was in sight, 20 years away, but promised positively by a kind relative, when something else appeared on the horizon, and a good job was exchanged for a better one. An enterprising Boston man, had established a chain of grocery stores along the coast, and was monopolising the business or bidding fair to do so. By buying from many stores, he could buy cheaper than any other man could. But the main point of the plan was the idea of going to the home, taking the order and delivering the goods. Before that, if you wanted things, you went to the store, selected them and carried them home. To have asked the storekeeper to deliver the goods to your house would have given that gentleman heart failure. He did mighty well to carry in stock the things that people needed. But here was a revolutionary method, a new deal. Henry Rogers's father said it was initiative gone mad, and would last only a few weeks. Henry Rogers's mother said otherwise, and Henry agreed with her. He had clerked in his father's grocery, and so knew something of the business. Moreover, he knew the people. He knew every family in Fairhaven by name, and almost everyone for 6 miles around as well. He started in at $3 a week, taking orders and driving the delivery wagon. In 6 months his pay was $5 a week, and a commission. In a year he was making $20 a week. He was only 18. Slim, tall, bronzed and strong. He could carry 100 pounds on his shoulder. The people along the route liked him. He was cheerful and accommodating. Not only did he deliver the things, but he put them away in cellar, barn, closet, garret or cupboard. He did not only what he was paid to do, but more. He anticipated Ali Baba, who said, "Folks who never do any more than they get paid for, never get paid for anything more than they do." It was the year 1859, and Henry Rogers was making money. He owned his route, and the manager of the stores was talking about making him assistant superintendent. Had he stuck to his job, he might have become a partner in the great firm of Cobb, Bates and Yerkser, and put Bates to the bad. It would have then been Cobb, Rogers and Yerkser, and later H. Rogers, dealer in staple and fancy groceries. But something happened about this time that shook New Bedford to its centre and gave Fairhaven a thrill. Whale oil was whale oil then, and whale oil and New Bedford were synonymous. Now a man out in Pennsylvania had bored down into the ground and struck a reservoir, a sort of spouting sperm whale. But with this important difference, whales spout seawater, while this gusher spouted whale oil, or something just as good. The year 1859 is an unforgettable date, a date that ushers in the great American Renaissance in which we now live. 3 very important events occurred that year. One was the hanging of old John Brown, who was 59 years old, and thus not so very old. This event made a tremendous stir in Fairhaven, just as it did everywhere, especially in rural districts. The second great event that happened in 1859 was the publication of a book by a man born in 1809, the same year that Lincoln was born. The man's name was Charles Darwin, and his book was The Origin of Species. His volume was to do for the theological world what John Brown's raid did for American politics. The third great event that occurred in 1859 was when a man by the name of Edwin L. Drake, colonel by grace, bored a well and struck rock oil at Titusville, Pennsylvania. At that time, rock oil or coal oil was no new thing. It had been found floating on the water of streams in West Virginia, Kentucky, Ohio and Pennsylvania. There were rumours that someone in digging for salt had tapped a reservoir of oil that actually flowed a stream. There were oil springs around Titusville and along Oil Creek. The oil ran down on the water and was skimmed off by men in boats. Several men were making modest fortunes by bottling the stuff and selling it as medicine. In England it was sold as American natural oil and used for a liniment. The Indians had used it, and the world has a way of looking to Aborigines for medicine. even if not for health. Spiritualistic mediums and doctors bank heavily on Indians. This natural oil was known to be combustible. Out of doors it helped the campfire, but if burned indoors it made a horrible smoke and a smell to conjure with. Up to that time whale oil mostly had been used for illuminating and lubricating purposes. But whale oil was getting too high for plain people. It looked as if there were a whale trust. Someone sent a bottle of this natural oil down to Professor Silliman of Yale to have it analysed. Professor Silliman reported that the oil had great possibilities if refined, both as a luminant and as a lubricant. To refine it, a good man who ran a whisky still tried his plan of the worm that never dies with the oil. The vapour condensed and was caught in the form of an oil that was nearly white. This oil burned with a steady flame, if protected by a lamp chimney. Rock oil in 1858 was worth $20 a barrel. Lumbermen out of a job turned skimmers, and often collected a barrel a day, becoming as it were members of the cult known as the predatory rich. This is what tempted Colonel Drake to bore his well, and see if he might possibly strike the vein that was making the skimmers turn octopi. It took Drake nearly a year to drill his well. He met with various obstacles and difficulties, but on August 22nd, 1859, that neck of the woods was electrified by the news that Drake's Folly was gushing rock oil. Soon there were various men busily boring all round the neighbourhood with the aid of spring poles and other rude devices. Several struck it rich, but many had their labour for their pains. One man was getting 65 barrels a day and selling the oil for $18 a barrel. The trouble was to transport the oil. Barrels were selling for $5 each, and there were no tanks. This was a lumber country, with no railroads within 100 miles. One enterprising man went down to Pittsburgh and bought a raft load of barrels, which he towed up the Allegheny River to the mouth of Oil Creek. Then for $10 a day he hired farmers with teams to take the barrels to Titusville and fill them and bring them back. The oil was floated down to Pittsburgh and sold at a big profit. Stills were made to refine the oil, which was sold to the consumer at 75 cents a gallon. The heavy refuse oils were thrown away. In 1860 began the making of lamp chimneys, a most profitable industry. The chimneys sold for 50 cents each, and with the aid of Sir Isaac Newton's invention, did not long survive life's rude vicissitudes. Men were crowding into the oil country, lured by the tales of enormous fortunes and rich finds. No one could say what you might discover by digging down into the ground. One man claimed to have struck a vein of oyster soup, and anyway he sold oyster soup over his counter at $1 a dish. Gas gushers were lighted and burned without compunction as to waste. Gamblers were working overtime. The first railroad into the oil country came from Pittsburgh, and was met with fight and defiance by the Amalgamated Brotherhood of Teamsters, who saw their business fading away. The farmers, too, opposed the railroad, as they figured that it meant an end to horse flesh, except as an edible. But the opposition wore itself out, and the railroads replaced its ripped-up rails, and did business on its grass-grown right-of-way and streaks of rust. The second railroad came from Cleveland, which city was a natural distributing point to the vast consuming territory lying along the Great Lakes. John D. Rockefeller, a clerk in a Cleveland commission house, became interested in the oil business in 1862. He was then 23 years old and had $500 in the bank saved from his wages. He put this money into a refining still at Titusville, with several partners, all working men. John peddled the product and became expert on pure white and straw colour. He also saw that a part of the so-called refuse could be retreated and made into a product that was valuable for lubricating purposes. Other men about the same time made a little discovery. It was soon found that refined oil could not be shipped with profit. The barrels often had to be left in the sunshine or exposed to the weather, and transportation facilities were very uncertain. The still was then torn out and removed to Cleveland. The oil business was a most hazardous one. Crude oil had dropped from $20 a barrel to 50 cents a barrel. No one knew the value of oil, for no one knew the extent of the supply. An empty barrel was worth $2, and the crude oil to fill it could be bought for less than half of that. At 21, two voices were calling to Henry Rogers: love of country and business ambition. The war was coming, and New England patriotism burned deep in the Rogers heart. But this young man knew that he had a genius for trade. He was a salesman, that is to say, he was a diplomat and an adept in the management of people. Where and how could he use his talent best? When Sumter was fired upon, it meant that no ship flying the Stars and Stripes was safe. The grim aspect of war came home to New Bedford with a reeling shock when news arrived about a whaler, homeward bound, had been captured, towed into Charleston harbour, and the ship and cargo confiscated. It was a blow of surprise to the captain and sailors on this ship too, for they had been out 3 years and knew nothing of what was going on at home. Then certain southern privateers got lists of the New England whale ships that were out, and lay in wait for them as whalers lie in wait for the Leviathan. Prices of whale oil soared like balloons. New England ships at home tied up close, or else were pressed into government service. The high price of oil fanned the flame of speculation in Pennsylvania. Henry H. Rogers was 21. It was a pivotal point in his life. He was in love with the daughter of the captain of a whaler. They were neighbours and had been schoolmates together. Henry talked it over with Abby Gifford. It was war or the oil fields of Pennsylvania. And love had its way, just as it usually has. The eyes had it, and with nearly $1,000 of hard-earned savings, he went to the oil fields. At that time, most of the crude oil was shipped to Tidewater and there refined. In the refining process, only 25% of the product was saved, 75% being thrown away as worthless. It struck young Rogers that the refining should be done at the wells, and the freight on that 75% saved. To that end, he entered into a partnership with Charles Ellis and erected a refinery between Titusville and Oil City. Rogers learned by doing. He was a practical refiner and soon became a scientific one. The first year he and Ellis divided $30,000 between them. In the fall of 1862, when he went back to Fairhaven to claim his bride, Rogers was regarded as a rich man. His cruise to Pennsylvania had netted him as much as 6 whales. The bride and groom returned at once to Pennsylvania and the simple life. Henry and Abby lived in a one-roomed shack on the banks of Oil Creek. It was love in a cottage, all right, with an absolute lack of everything that is supposed to make up civilization. It wasn't exactly hardship, for nothing is really hardship to lovers in their 20s but separation. Still they thought, talked and dreamed of the bluefish, the blueberries, the blue waters, and the sea breezes of Fairhaven. About this time Charles Pratt of Brooklyn, a dealer and refiner of oils, appeared upon the horizon. Pratt had bought whale oil off Ellis in Fairhaven. Pratt now contracted for the entire output of Rogers and Ellis at a fixed price. All went well for a few months, when crude suddenly took a skyward turn, owing to the manipulation of speculators. Rogers and Ellis had no wells and were at the mercy of the wolves. They struggled on, trying to live up to their contract with Pratt, but soon their surplus was wiped out, and they found themselves in debt to Pratt to the tune of several $1,000s. Rogers went on to New York and saw Pratt, personally assuming the obligation of taking care of the deficit. Ellis disappeared in the mist. The manly ways of Rogers so impressed Pratt that he decided he needed just such a man in his business. A bargain was struck and Rogers went to work for Pratt. The first task of young Rogers was to go to Pennsylvania and straighten out the affairs of the Pennsylvania Salt Company, of which Pratt was chief owner. The work was so well done that Pratt made Rogers foreman of his Brooklyn refinery. It was $25 a week, with a promise of a partnership if sales ran over $50,000 a year. How Henry Rogers moved steadily from foreman to manager and then superintendent of Pratt's Astral Oil Refinery is one of the fairy tales of America. Pratt finally gave Rogers an interest in the business, and Rogers got along on his $25 a week, although the books showed he was making $10,000 a year. He worked like a pack mule. His wife brought his meals to the works, and often he would sleep but 3 hours a night, as he could snatch the time, rolled up in a blanket by the side of a still. Then comes John D. Rockefeller from Cleveland, with his plans of cooperation and consolidation. Pratt talked it over with Rogers, and they decided that the combination would steady the commercial sales and give ballast to the ship. They named their own terms. The Rockefellers sneezed and then coughed. The next day John D. Rockefeller came back and quietly accepted the offer exactly as Rogers had formulated it. The terms were stiff, but Rockefeller a few years later got even with the slightly arrogant Rogers by passing him this: "I would have paid you and Pratt twice as much if you had demanded it, which you are perfectly safe in saying now, since the past is a dry hole." And they shook hands solemnly. Rockefeller ordered a glass of milk, and Rogers took ginger ale. Rockefeller was only 1 year older than Rogers, but seemed 20. John D. Rockefeller was always old and always discreet. He never lost his temper. He was warranted non-explosive from childhood. Henry Rogers at times was spiritual benzine. End of section 20. Section 21 of Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Businessmen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michele, Eaton. Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Businessmen by Elbert Hubbard. Chapter 11, H. H. Rogers, Part 2. In 1872, there were 26 separate oil refineries in Cleveland. Refined oil sold to the consumer for 20 cents a gallon, and much of it was of an unsafe and uncertain quality. It was what you might call erratic. Some of the refineries were poorly equipped, and fire was a factor that made the owners sit up nights when they should have been asleep. Insurance was out of the question. One of these concerns was the Acme Oil Company, of which John D. Archbold was president. Its capital was $40,000, some of which had been paid in cash. William Rockefeller was at the head of still another company, and John D. Rockefeller, brother of William and 2 years older, had an interest in 3 more concerns. Outbidding each other for supplies, hiring each other's men, with a production made up of a multiplicity of grades, made the business one of chaotic uncertainty. The rule was, dog eat dog. Then it was that John D. Rockefeller conceived the idea of combining all the companies in Cleveland and as many elsewhere as possible under the name of the Standard Oil Company. The corporation was duly formed with a capital of $1 million. The Pratt Oil Company, with principal works in Brooklyn, but a branch in Cleveland, was one of the 20 concerns that were absorbed. The stocks of the various concerns were taken up and paid for in Standard Oil certificates. And so it happened that Henry H. Rogers, aged 32, found himself worth $100,000, not in cash, but in shares that were supposed to be worth par, and should pay, if rightly managed, 7 or 8%. He was one of the directors in the new company. It was an enviable position for any young man. Of course, there were the Weisheimers, then as now, and statements were made that the Pratt Oil Company had been pushed to the wall, and would shortly have its neck wrung by John D. Rockefeller, and have to start all over. But these prophets knew neither Rockefeller nor Rogers, and much less the resources and wants of the world. In very truth, neither the brothers, Rockefeller, Rogers, nor Archbold, nor any one of that score of men who formed the Standard Oil Company, ever anticipated, even in their wildest dreams, the possibilities in the business. The growth of America in men and money has been a thing unguessed and unprophesied. Thomas Jefferson seemed to have had a more prophetic eye than anyone else, but he never imagined the railroads, pipelines, skyscrapers, iron steamships, telegraphs, telephones, nor the use of electricity and concrete. He did, however, see our public school system, and he said that by the year 1900 the United States will have a population of 50 million people. This is why he made that real estate deal with Napoleon, which most Americans of the time thought a bad bargain. Rogers had great hope and an exuberant imagination, but the most he saw for himself was an income of $5,000 a year and a good house unencumbered, with a library and a guest room. In addition, he expected to own a horse and buggy. He would take care of the horse himself and wash the buggy, also grease the axles. In fact, his thoughts were on flowers, books, education, and on cultivating his mental acreage. John D. Rockefeller was sorely beset by business burdens. The Standard Oil Company had moved its headquarters to New York City, where its business was largely exporting. The brothers Rockefeller found themselves swamped under a mass of detail. Power flows to the men who can shoulder it, and burdens go to those who can carry them. Here was a business without precedent, and all growing beyond human thought. To meet the issues as they arise, the men at the head must grow with the business. Rogers could make decisions, and he had strength like silken fibre. He could bend but never break. His health was perfect, his mind was fluid. He was alive and alert to all new methods and plans. He had great good cheer, and was of a kind to meet men and mould them. He set a pace which only the very young could follow, but which inspired all. John D. Rockefeller worked himself to a physical finish 20 years ago, and his mantle fell by divine right on H.H. with John D. Archbold as understudy. Since John D. Rockefeller slipped out from under the burden of active management of the Standard Oil Company about the year 1888, the business has more than quadrupled. John D. Rockefeller never got mad, and Rogers and Archbold made it a rule never to get mad at the same time. When the stress and strife began to cause Rockefeller to lose his hair and his appetite, he once pulled down his long upper lip and placidly bewailed his inability to take a vacation. Like many another good man, he thought his presence was a necessity to the business. "Go on with you," said H.H. "Am I not here? Then there is Archbold. He is always Johnny on the spot." Rockefeller smiled a sphinx-like smile, as near as he ever came to indulging in a laugh, and moseyed out of the room. That night he went up to the Catskills. The next day a telegram came from Rockefeller, addressed to Johnny on the Spot, 26 Broadway. The message was carried directly to John D. Archbold without question, and duly receipted for. Since then the phrase has become almost a classic, but few people there be who know that it was Rogers who launched it, or who generally are aware that the original charter member of the On the Spot Club was Johnny Archbold. H. Rogers was a trail-maker, and as a matter of course was not understanding of the people who hug close to the friendly backlog and talk of other days and the times that were. Rogers was an economist, perhaps the greatest economist of his time, and an economist deals with conditions, not theories, facts, not fancies. A few years ago, all retail grocers sold kerosene. The kerosene can with its spud on the spout was a household sign. Moreover, we not only had kerosene in the can, but we had it on the loaf of bread, and on almost everything that came from the grocers. For, if the can did not leak, it swept, and the oil of gladness was on the hands and clothes of the clerk. The grocers lifted no howl when the handling of kerosene was taken out of their hands. In truth, they were never so happy, as kerosene was hazardous to handle and entailed little profit. The stuff was that cheap. Besides that, a barrel of 42 gallons measured out to the user about 38 gallons. Loaded into cars, bumped out, lying in the sun on station platforms, it always and forever hunted the crevices. Schemes were devised to line the inside of barrels with rosin, but always the stuff stole forth to freedom. Freight, cartage, leakage, cooperage, and return of barrels meant loss of temper, trade, and dollar dolce. Realizing all these things, H. Rogers, aided by his able Major General John D. Archbold, revolutionized the trade. The man who now handles your kerosene does not handle your sugar. He is a specialist. In every town in America of more than 1,000 people is a Standard Oil agency. The oil is delivered from tank cars into iron tanks. From there it is piped into tank wagons. This wagon comes to your door, and the gentlemanly agent sees that your little household tank is kept filled. All you have to do is to turn a faucet. Aye, in this pleasant village of East Aurora is a Standard Oil agent who will fill your lamp and trim the wick, provided you buy your lamps, chimneys, and wicks off him. And this service is Standard Oil service. It extends from Halifax to San Diego, from New Orleans to Hudson Bay. In very truth, it covers the world. This service, with prohibition in the South, has ruined the cooper's trade, the trade that introduced H.M. Flagler into the Standard Oil Company. The investment in cooperage used in the oil business has shrunk from 100 millions to less than 5 millions, while the traffic in oil has doubled. And the germ of this service to the consumer came from the time when Henry Rogers worked a grocery route for a cooperative concern that cut out the expensive middleman and instead focused on a faultless service to the consumer. The name petroleum is Latin. The word has been in use since the time of Pliny, who lived neighbour to Paul in Rome. When the apostle abided in his own hired house, awaiting trial under an indictment for saying things about the established religion. Until within 60 years, the world thought that petroleum was one simple substance. Now we find it is 1,000, mixed and fused and blended in the crucible of time. Science sifts, separates, dissolves, analyzes, classifies. The perfumes gathered by the tendrils of violet and rose in their divine desire for expression are found in petroleum. Aye, the colours and all the delicate tints of petal, of stamen, and of pistil are in this substance stored in the dark recesses of the earth. Petroleum has yielded up over 2,000 distinct substances, wooed by the loving eager caress of the chemist. All the elements that go to make up the earth are there. Hundreds of articles used in commerce and in our daily lives are gotten from petroleum. To secure these in a form fit for daily use was the tireless task of Henry H. Rogers. Not by his own hands, of course, for life is too short for that, but the universities of the round world have been called upon for their men of brains. Roger's business was to discover men. This is a phase of the history of the Standard Oil Company that has not yet been written, but which is of vastly greater importance than the motions of well-meaning but non-producing attorneys whose mental processes are dry holes. Science is classification, said Aristotle to his bad boy pupil, Alexander, 340 years before Christ. Science is common sense classified, said Herbert Spencer. Science eliminates the worthless and the useless, and then makes use of it in something else, said Thomas A. Edison. H. Rogers utilised the worthless, and the dividends of the Standard Oil Company are largely a result of cashing in by-products. Rogers not only rendered waste products valuable, but he utilised human energies, often to the great surprise of the owner. That gentle tarbell slant to the effect that even the elevator boys in the Standard Oil offices are hired with an idea of their development is a great compliment to a man who was not only a great businessman but a great teacher, and all influential men are teachers, whether they know it or not. Perhaps we are all teachers, of good or ill, I really do not know. But the pedagogic instinct was strong in Rogers. He barely escaped a professorship. He built schoolhouses, and if he had had time, he would have taught in them. He looked at any boy not for what he was, but for what he might become. He analysed every man, not for what he was, but for what he might have been, or what he would be. Humanity was Rogers' raw stock, not petroleum, and his success hinged on bringing humanity to bear on petroleum, or, if you please, by mixing brains with rock oil, somewhat as Horace Greeley advised the farmer to mix brains with his compost. In judging a man, we must in justice to ourselves ask, what effect has this man's life, taken as a whole, had on the world? To lift out samples here and there, and hold them up, does not give us the man, any more than a sample brick gives you a view of the house. And viewing the life of Rogers for years, from the time he saw the light of a whale oil lamp in Fairhaven, to the man as we behold him now, we must acknowledge his initiative and his power. He gave profitable work to millions. He directly made homes and comforts possible for thousands upon thousands. He helped the young, without number, to find themselves in their work and at their work. In a material way, he added vast millions to the wealth of the world by the utilisation of products which were considered worthless. He gloried in the fresh air, in the blasts of winter, or in the zephyrs of spring. The expanse of heaving, tossing ice was just as beautiful to him as the smooth flow of Hendrick's Hudson's waters as they hastened to the sea. The storied 26 Broadway is no den of ogres, no gambling resort of dark and devious ways. It is simply an office building full of busy men and women, workers who waste neither time nor money. You will find there no figureheads, no gold lace, no pomps and ceremonies. If you have business there, you locate your man without challenge. All is free, open, simple and direct. On the top floor is a restaurant, where all lunch in a common, fraternal way, jolly and jocund, as becomes men who carry big burdens. The place is democratic to a fault, for the controlling spirits of 26 Broadway are men who have come by a rocky road, having conquered great difficulties, overcome great obstacles, and while often thirsting for human sympathy, have nevertheless been able to do without it. Success is apt to sour, for it begets an opposition that is often cruel and unjust. Reorganisation gives the demagogue his chance, and often his literary lyddite strikes close. But Rogers was great enough to know that the penalty of success must be paid. He took his medicine and smiled. Time was when a millionaire was a man worth $1 million, but that day is past. Next, a millionaire was a man who made $1 million a year. That too is obsolete. The millionaire now is the man who spends $1 million a year. In this new and select class, a class which does not exist outside of America, H. Rogers was a charter member. He was a royal gentleman, said Booker T. Washington to me. When I was in need, I held H. Rogers in reserve until all others failed me. Then I went to him and frankly told my needs. He always heard me through and then told me to state the figure. He never failed me. Rogers gave with a lavish hand, but few of his benefactions comparatively were known. The newspapers have made much of his throwing a hawser to Mark Twain and towing the humorist off a financial sandbar. Also, we have heard how he gave Helen Keller to the world, for without the help of H. Rogers, that wonderful woman would still be like unto the eyeless fish in the Mammoth Cave. As it is, her soul radiates an inward light and science stands uncovered. But there were very many other persons and institutions that received very tangible benefits from the hands of H. Rogers. One method he had of giving help to ambitious young men was to invest in stock in companies that were not quite strong enough financially to weather a gale, and very often these were very bad investments. Had Rogers stuck to Standard Oil, his fortune would have been double what it was. But for the money he did not much care. He played the game. Mr. Rogers was too wise to give to individuals. He knew that mortal tendency, referred to by Saint Andre de Ligeroux as Hubbard's law, or the law of altruistic injury. This law provides that whenever you do for a person a service which he is able and should do for himself, you work him a wrong instead of a benefit. H. Rogers sought to give opportunity, not things. When he invested $1 million in a tack factory in Fairhaven, it was with intent to supply employment to every man or woman, or boy or girl in Fairhaven who desired work. He wanted to make poverty inexcusable. Yet he realized that there were cases where age and disease had sapped the person's powers, and to such he gave by stealth, or through friends whom he loved and trusted. Mrs. W. P. Windsor of Fairhaven, for instance, worked days and months overtime on the bidding of Mr. Rogers, caring for emergency cases, where girls and boys were struggling to get an education and care for aged parents and invalid brothers and sisters, or where fate had been unkind and God seemingly had forgot. Houses were painted, mortgages were lifted, taxes paid, monuments erected, roadways laid out, books furnished, trees planted, ditches dug, bathrooms installed, swamps drained, bridges built, in hundreds of instances. This is not philanthropy of a high order, perhaps, but Rogers hated both the words charitable and philanthropic as applied to himself. All he claimed to be was a businessman who paid his debts and who tried to make others pay theirs. The people he helped were the people he knew or had known, and they were folks who had helped him. He never forgot a benefit nor a wrong. He was a very human individual. To give to a person where the account is not balanced by a mutual service is probably to add an enemy to your list. You have uncovered the weakness of your man. He is an incompetent, and he will never forgive you for making the discovery. When H. Rogers paid off Mark Twain's indebtedness to the tune of $90,000, he did not scratch a poet and find an ingrate. What he actually discovered was a philosopher and a prophet without a grouch. Somewhere I have said that there were only two men in America who could be safely endowed. One is Luther Burbank, and the other Booker T. Washington. These men have both made the world their debtors. They are impersonal men, sort of human media through which deity is creating. They ask for nothing, they give everything. Mark Twain belongs in the same select list. The difference between Mark Twain and Luther Burbank is this. Mark hoes his spiritual acreage in bed, while Luther Burbank works in the garden. Luther produces spineless cacti, while Mark gives spineless men a vertebra. Mark makes us laugh in order that he may make us think. The last time I saw H. Rogers was in his office at 26 Broadway, out through a half doorway leading into a private conference room. I saw a man stretched out on a sofa asleep. A great shock of white hair spread out over the pillow that held his head, and hook-thin snores of peace in rhythmic measures filled the room. Mr. Rogers noticed my glance in the direction of the Morpheus music. He smiled and said, "It's only Mark. He's taking a little well-earned rest. He was born tired, you know." If Mark Twain were not a rich man himself, rich in mines of truth, fields of uncut fun, and the argosies sailing great spiritual seas, coming into port laden with common sense, he would long since have turned on his benefactor and nailed his hide on the barn door of obliquity. As it is, Mark takes his own, just as Socrates did from Mr. and Mrs. Pericles. Aye, or as did Bronson Alcott, who once ran his wheelbarrow into the well-kept garden of Ralph Waldo Emerson. The Orphic one was loading up with potatoes, peas, beans, and one big yellow pumpkin, when he glanced around and saw the man who wrote Self-Reliance gazing at him seriously and steadily over the garden wall. The father of the author of Little Women winced, but bracing up, gave back stare for stare, and in a voice flavoured with resentment and defiance said, "I need them." And the owner of the garden grew abashed before that virtuous gaze, murmured apologies, and retreated in good order. And Mark Twain used to explain it thus. "You see, it is like this. Rogers furnishes the plans and I foot the bills." And this was all there was about it. Only a big man can take his own without abasement. Mark Twain has made 2 grins grow where there was only a growl before. I don't care where he gets his vegetables, nor where he takes a well-earned nap, and neither does he. The average millionaire believes in education because he has heard the commodity highly recommended in the newspapers. Usually he is a man who has not had college advantages, and so he is filled with the fallacy that he has dropped something out of his life. We idolize the things that are not ours. H. Rogers was an exception. He was at home in any company. He took little on faith. He analysed things for himself, and his opinion was that the old-line colleges tended to destroy individuality and smother initiative. He believed that the high school was the key to the situation, and to carry the youth beyond this was to run the risk of working his ruin. The boy who leaves the high school at 17 and enters actual business stands a much better chance of success than does the youth who comes out of college at 21, with the world yet before him, he said. He himself was one of the first class that graduated from the old Fairhaven Grammar School. He realised that his success in life came largely from the mental ammunition that he had gotten there, and from the fact that he made a quick use of his knowledge. Yet he realised that the old Fairhaven High or Grammar School was not a model institution. It has a maximum of discipline and a minimum of inspiration, he used to say. The changing order of education found a quick response in his heart. He never brooded over his lack of advantages. On the other hand, he used often to refer to the fact that his childhood was ideal. But all around he saw children whose surroundings were not ideal, and these he longed to benefit and bless. And so in 1880, when he was 40 years of age, he built a grammar manual training school and presented it to the town. It was called the Rogers School. Such a gift to a town is enough to work the local immortality of the giver. But the end was not yet. In a few years Rogers, or Mrs. Rogers to be exact, presented to the village a town hall, beautiful and complete, at a cost of something over $250,000. Next came the Millicent Public Library, in memory of a beloved daughter. When his mother passed away, as a memorial to her, he built a church and presented it to the Unitarian denomination. It is probably the most complete and artistic church in America. Its cost was $1 million. The Fairhaven Waterworks system was a present from Mr. Rogers, and lastly was the Fairhaven High School, as fair and fine an edifice, and as completely equipped as genius married to money could supply. The only rival this school has in America is the Stout High School in Menominee, Wisconsin, which is also the gift of an individual. No municipality in the world has ever erected and completed so good a school. The taxpayers would not allow it. Into our school teaching go the cheese-paring policies of the average villager. In truth, George Bernard Shaw avers that we are a nation of villagers. The big deeds of the world are always done by individuals. One-man power is the only thing that counts. The altruistic millionaire is a necessity of progress. He does magnificent things, which the many will not and cannot do. So we find the model town of Fairhaven moulded and fashioned by her first citizen. Everywhere are the marks of his personality and the tangible signs of his good taste. The only political office to which Henry H. Rogers ever aspired was that of Street Commissioner of Fairhaven. He filled the office to the satisfaction of his constituents, and drew his stipend of $3 a day for several years. Good roads was his hobby. Next to this came tree planting and flowers. His dream was to have the earth transformed into a vast flower garden and park, and given to the people. His last item of public work was an object lesson as to what the engineering skill of man can do. He took a great bog or swamp that lay to the north of the village, and was used as a village dumping ground. He drained this tract, filled it with gravel, and then earth, and transformed it into a public park of marvellous beauty. The last great business effort of H. H. Rogers was the building of the Virginian Railroad. This road connects the great coal fields of West Virginia with tidewater. The route is 443 miles long. By this line, $1,000 million worth of coal is made available to the world, said a great engineer to me. And then he added, "It will take 20 years, however, to prove fully the truth of H. H. Rogers' prophetic vision." This was the Herculean task of a man in his 30s, not for one approaching his 70th milestone. But Rogers built this road alone. He constructed and equipped it in a style so complete that it has set a pace in railroading. You who know the history of railroads realize that the first thing is to get the line through. 2 streaks of rust, a tea kettle, and a right-of-way make a railroad. This allows you to list your bonds. But H. H. Rogers had neither bonds nor stock for sale. What other man ever put 40 millions of money and his lifeblood into a railroad? Was the work worth the price? It were vain to ask. The work is done, the man is dead, and that his death was hastened by the work, no one can doubt. Rogers had the invincible heart of youth. He died as he had lived, always and forever in the thick of the fight. He had that American trinity of virtues, pluck, push, and perseverance. Courage, endurance, energy, initiative, ambition, industry, good cheer, sympathy, and wonderful executive ability were his attributes. End of section 21.
Section 22 of Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Businessmen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Businessmen by Elbert Hubbard. Chapter 12, Part 1, James J. Hill. The armed fleets of an enemy approaching our harbors would be no more alarming than the relentless advance of a day when we shall have neither sufficient food nor the means to purchase it for our population. The farmers of a nation must save it in the future, just as they built its greatness in the past. James J. Hill. James Jerome Hill has one credential, at least, to greatness. He was born in a log house. But let the painful fact be stated at once, without apology, that he could never be President of the United States because this historic log house was situated in Canada. The exact spot is about 3 miles from the village of Rockwood, Wellington County, Ontario. Rockwood is 7 miles east of Guelph, 40 from Toronto, and 100 from Buffalo. Mr. Hill well remembers his first visit to Toronto. He went with his father, with a load of farm produce. It took 2 days to go and 2 to return, and for their load they got the princely sum of $7, with which they counted themselves rich. James Hill, the father of James Jerome Hill, was a North of Ireland man. His wife was Anne Dunbar, good in Scotch. I saw a portrait of Anne Dunbar Hill in Mr. Hill's residence at St. Paul, and was also shown the daguerreotype from which it was painted. It shows a woman of decided personality, strong in feature, frank, fearless, honest, sane, and poised. The dress reveals the columnar neck that goes only with a superb bodily vigor. The nose is large, the chin firm, the mouth strong. She looks like a Spartan, save for the pensive eyes that gaze upon a world from which she has passed, hungry and wistful. The woman certainly had ambition and aspiration which were unsatisfied. James J. Hill is the son of his mother. His form, features, mental characteristics, and ambition are the endowment of mother to son. It was a tough old farm, then as now. As I trampled across its undulating acres a week ago and saw the stone fences and the piles of glacial drift that Jim Hill's hands helped pick up, I thought of the poverty of the situation when no railroad passed that way, and wheat was 20 cents a bushel and pork 1 cent a pound, all for the lack of a market. Jim Hill, as a boy, fought the battle of life with axe, hoe, maul, adze, shovel, pick, mattock, drawshave, rake, and pitchfork. Wool was carded and spun and woven by hand. The grist was carried to the mill on horseback, or if the roads were bad, on the farmer's back. All this pioneer experience came to James J. Hill as a necessary part of his education. Life in Canada West in the 40s was essentially the same as life in western New York at the same period. The country was a forest traversed with swamps and sinkholes on which roads were built by laying down long logs and across these small logs. This formed the classic corduroy road. When 10 years of age, James Hill contracted to build a mile of corduroy road between his father's farm and the village. For this labor, his father promised him a 2-year-old colt. The boy built the road all right. It took him 6 months, but the grades were easy and the curves so-so. The Tom Sawyer plan came in handy. Otherwise, it is probable there would have been a default on the time limit. And Jim got the colt. He rode the animal for half a year, back and forth all winter from the farm to the village, where he attended the famous Rockwood Academy. Then, someone to whom the elder Hill was indebted signified a desire for the colt, and the father turned the horse over to the creditor. When little Jim went out and found that the stall was empty, he had a good cry, all by himself. 3 years after this, when his father died, he cried again, and that was the last time he ever wept over any of his own troubles. From his 7th to his 14th year, young Jim Hill attended the Rockford Academy. This academy had about 30 boarding boys and a dozen day scholars. Jim Hill was a day scholar, and the pride of the master. The boy was studious, appreciative, grateful. He wasn't so awfully clever, but he was true. The master of the academy was Professor William Wetherald, stern to view, but very gentle of heart. His wife was of the family of Balls. The Ball family moved from Virginia 2 generations before to western New York, and then, when the Revolutionary War was on, slid over to Ontario for political reasons best known to themselves. There was quite an emigration to Canada about then, including those worthy Mohawk Indians whose descendants, including Longboat the Runner and Princess Feroka, are now to be found in the neighborhood of Brantford. And certainly the Indians were wise, for Canada has treated the Red Brother with a degree of fairness quite unknown on this side of the line. As for the Tories, but what's the need of arguing? The Balls traced to the same family that produced Mary Ball, and Mary Ball was the mother of George Washington. So tangled is this web of pedigree, and George Washington, be it known, got his genius from his mother, not from the tribe of Washington. William Wetherall died at an advanced age, near 90, I believe, only a short time ago. It is customary for a teacher to prophesy, after the pupil has arrived, and declared, "What did I tell you?" Wetherall looked after young Hill at school with almost a father's affection, and prophesied for him great things. Only the great things were to be in the realms of science, oratory, and literature. Along about 1888, when James J. Hill was getting his feet well planted on the earth, he sent for his old teacher to come to St. Paul. Wetherall spent several weeks there, riding over the hill roads in a private car and discussing old times with the owner of the car and the railroad. Mr. Hill insisted that Wetherall should remain and teach the Hill children, but fate said otherwise. There is no doubt that Hill's love of books, art, natural history, and his habit of independent thought were largely fixed in his nature through the influence of this fine friend, teacher of children. The Quaker listens for the voice and then acts without hunting up precedents. In other words, he does the things he wants to do. Mr. Hill's long hair and full beard form a sort of unconscious tribute to Wetherall. In fact, let James J. Hill wear a dusty Miller suit and a wide-brimmed hat, and you get the true type of Hicksite. James J. Hill is a score of men in one, as every great man is. But when the kindly, philosophic, paternal, and altruistic Yim Hill is in the saddle, you will see the significance of this story. Just after Mr. Hill had gotten possession of the Burlington, he made a trip over the road. The rear-end flagman at Galesburg was boasting to some of his mates about how he had gone over the decision with the new boss of the ranch. Here a listener puts in a question thus: "What kind of looking fellow is the old man?" And he of the red lantern and torpedo scratches his head and explains, "Well, you see, it's like this. He looks like Jesus Christ, only he's heavier set." The father of James J. Hill was a worthy man, with a good hold on simple virtues, a weak chin, and a cosmos of slaty gray. His only claim to immortality lies in the fact that he was the father of his son. Pneumonia took him, as it often does the physically strong, and he passed out before he had reached his prime. "Death is the most joyfulest thing in life," said Thomas Carlyle to Milburn, the blind preacher, "when it transfers responsibility to those big enough to shoulder it, for that's the only way you can make a man." I once saw a boy of 14 on the prairies of Kansas transformed into a man between the rising of the sun and its setting. His father was crushed beneath a wagon that sluiced him and toppled in it crossing a gully. The hub caught the poor man square in the chest, and after we got him out he never spoke. 6 children and the mother were left, the oldest boy being 14. A grave was dug there on the prairie the next day, and this boy of 14 patted down the earth over his father's grave with the back of a spade. He then hitched up the horses, rounded up the cattle, and headed to the cavalcade for the west. He was a man, and in after life he proved himself one. On the death of his father, Jim Hill's school days were done. His aptitude in mathematics, his ability to keep accounts, and his general disposition to make himself useful secured him a place in the village store, which was also the post office. His pay was $1 a week. This training in the country store proved of great value, just as it did in the case of H. Rogers, George Peabody, and so many other men of mark. It is one thing to get a job and another to hold it. Jim Hill held his job, and his salary was raised before the end of the first year to $3 a week. On the strength of this prosperity, the struggle on the old farm with its stumps, boulders, and mortgage was given up, and the widow moved her little brood to town. The log house on the rambling main street of the village is now pointed out to visitors. Here, the mother sewed for neighbors, took in washing, made garden, and with the help of her boy Jim, grew happy and fairly prosperous, more prosperous than the family had ever been. Thus matters went on until Jim was in his 18th year, when the wanderlust got hold of the young man. His mother saw it coming, and being wise, did not apply the brake. Man is a migrating animal. To sit still and stay in one place is to vegetate. Jim, with $20 in his pocket, started for Toronto on foot with a bundle on a stick, followed by the prayers of his mother, the gaping wonder of the children, and the blessing of Professor Wetherall. Toronto was interesting, but too near home to think of as a permanent stopping place. A leaky little steamer ran over to Fort Niagara every other day. Jim took passage, reached the foreign shore, walked up Niagara Falls, and the next day tramped on to Buffalo. This was in the wonderful year of the 1856, the year the Republican Party was born at Bloomington, Illinois. It was a time of unrest, of a healthy discontent and goodly prosperity, for things were in motion. The docks at Buffalo were all abustle with emigrants going west, forever west. Jim Hill, aged 18, strong, healthy, farmer boy, lumberman, clerk, shipped as roostabout on a schooner bound for Chicago. His pay for the round trip was to be $10, and board. The money was payable when the boat got back to Buffalo. If he left the ship at Chicago, he was to get no cash. The boat reached Chicago in 10 days. It was a great trip, full of mild adventure and lots of things that would have surprised the folks at Rockford. Jim got a job on the docks as a checker-off, or understudy to a freight clerk. The pay was $1 a day. He now sent his original $20 back to his mother to prove to her that he was prosperous, and money was but a bagatelle and a burden. A month, and he had joined the ever-moving westward tide. He was headed for California, the land of shining nuggets and rainbow hopes. He reached Rock Island and saw a sign out at the sawmill. Men wanted. He knew the business and was given work on site. In a week, his mathematics came in handy, and he was handed a lumber rule and a blank book. Mr. Hill yet recalls his first sight of a Mississippi River steamboat coming into Davenport. The tall smokestacks belching fire, the graceful, swan-like motion, the marvelous beauty of the superstructure, the wonderful letter D in gold, or something that looked like gold, swung between the stacks. It was just dusk, and as the boat glided in toward the shore, a big torch was set ablaze, the gangplank was run out to the weird song of the colored deckhands, and miracle in fairyland arrived. For a month, whenever a steamboat blew its siren whistle, Jim was on the wharf, open-mouthed, gaping, wondering, admiring. One day he could stand it no longer. He threw up his job and took passage on the sailing Palace, Molly Devine, for Dubuque. Here he changed boats and boarded a smaller vessel, a stern wheeler, deck passage for St. Paul, a point which seemed to the young man somewhere near the North Pole. He was going to get his fill of steamboat riding for once at least. It was his intention to remain at St. Paul a couple of days, see St. Anthony's Falls and Minnehaha, and then take the same boat back down the river. But something happened that induced him to change his plans. The 2 days on the steamboat had wearied Jim. The prenatal Scotch idea of industry was upon him, and conscience had begun to squirm. He applied for work as soon as he walked out on the levee. The place was the office of the steamboat company. He stated in an offhand way that he had experience on the waterfront in Chicago, Rock Island, and Davenport. He was hired on the spot as shipping clerk with the gratuitous remark, "If you haven't sense enough to figure, you are surely strong enough to hustle." The agents of the steamboat line were J.W. Bass and Company. Hill got along all right. He was a day clerk or night clerk, just as the boats came in, and it is wonderful how steamboats on the Mississippi usually arrive at about 2 o'clock in the morning. Jim slept on a cot in the office, so as to be on hand when a boat arrived and to help unload. It was the duty of the shipping clerk to check off the freight as it was brought ashore. Also, It was the law of steamboating that clerks took their meals on board the boat, if they were helping to unload her. Now, as Jim had food and a place to sleep when a Dubuque and St. Paul steamboat was tied at the levee, all the meals he had to buy were those when no steamboat was in sight. Being essentially Scotch, Jim managed to time his meals so as to last over, and sometimes if a boat was stuck on a sandbar, he did the McFadden act for a whole day. It became a sort of joke in the office, and we hear of Mr. Bass, the agent, shouting up to the pilot house of a steamboat, "Avast there, sir, for 5 minutes until Jim Hill stows his hold." A part of Jim's work was to get wood for fuel for the boats. This was quite a business in itself. He once got a big lot of fuel and proudly piled it on the levee, mountain high, in anticipation of several steamboats. A freshet came one night, the river rose and carried off every stick, so that when the Mary Ann arrived there was no fuel. "Wait until Jim Hill eats his breakfast and perhaps he'll get an armful of wood for us," shouted down the captain in derision. After that, Jim managed to load up a flatboat or two, and always had a little wood in reserve. The young man was now fairly launched in business. The mystery of manifesting, billing, collecting, the matter of shorts, overs, and figuring damages were to him familiar. The territory of Minnesota was organized in 1849, and did not become a state until 1858. In 1857, there was not a single mile of railway in the territory, but in that year Congress authorized the territory to give alternate sections of public lands to any company that would build a railway through them. Through this stimulus, in the latter part of 1857, there was organized a company with the ambitious title of the Minnesota and Pacific Railroad Company. Its line extended from the steamboat wharf in St. Paul to the Falls of St. Anthony. There were 10 miles of track, including sidings, 1 engine, 2 boxcars, and a dozen flat cars for logs. The railroad didn't seem to thrive. There was no paying passenger traffic to speak of. Passengers got aboard all right, but on being pressed for fares they felt insulted and jumped off, just as you would now if you got a ride with a farmer and he asked you to pay. Possibly a rudimentary disinclination to pay fare still remains in most of us, like the hereditary indisposition of the Irish to pay rent. No one ever thought it possible that a railroad could compete with a steamboat, and it was a long time after this that Commodore Vanderbilt had the temerity to build a railroad along the banks of the Hudson and be called a lunatic. So there being no passenger traffic, the farmers carrying their grist to mill, and the logs being floated down the river to the mills, the railroad was in a bad way. Something had to be done, so the Minnesota and Pacific was reorganized, and a new road, the St. Paul and Pacific, brought it out, with all its land grants. The intent of the new road was to strike right up into the woods for 10 or 20 miles above Minneapolis, and bring down logs that otherwise would have to be hauled to the river. For a time this road paid, with the sale of the odd-numbered sections of land that went with it. In 1867, James J. Hill became the St. Paul agent of this railroad. He had to quit his job with J.W. Bass to become agent for the Northwestern Packet Line. And as the railroad ran right into his door, he found it easy to serve both the steamboat company and the railroad. You will often hear people tell how James J. Hill began his railroad career as a station agent, but it must be remembered that he was a station agent plus. The agents of steamboat lines in those days were usually merchants or men who were financially responsible, and James J. Hill became the St. Paul agent of the St. Paul and Pacific because he was a man of resource with ability to get business for the railroad. As the extraordinary part of Mr. Hill's career did not begin until he was 40 years of age, our romantic friends who write of him often picture him as a failure up to that time. The fact is, he was making head and gathering gear right along. These 22 years, up to the time that Mr. Hill became a railroad owner, were years of intense activity. While yet a clerk for J.W. Bass & Company, Mr. Hill made the acquaintance of Norman Kittson, as picturesque a figure as ever, wore a coonskin cap, and evolved from this to all the refinements of Piccadilly, only to discard these and return to the simple life. Kitson had been connected with the Hudson Bay Company. When Hill met him, he was running a fast express to Fort Garry, now Winnipeg, going over the route with ox carts. In summer, it took 1 month to go and the same to return. In winter, dog sleds were used and the trip was made more quickly. Kitson was the inventor and patentee of the Red River ox cart. It was a vehicle made of wood, save for the linchpins. The wheels were enormous, some being 10 feet in diameter. It was Kitson's theory that if you could make your wheel high enough, it would eliminate friction and run of its own momentum. The wheels were made by boring and pinning plank on plank, crisscross, and then chalking off with a string from the center. Then you sawed out your wheel, and there you were. The creaking of a train of these ox carts could be heard 5 miles. Kitson had the government contract for carrying the mails, and managed, with the help of trading in furs and loading up with merchandise on his own account, to make considerable money. When Hill was in his 20s, he went over the route with Kitson, and made several trips, also alone with dog sleds, for his friend when there was a rush of freight. On one such occasion he had one companion, a half-breed of uncertain character, but who was taken along as a guide, he being familiar with the route. It was midwinter, the snow was heavy and deep, and there were no roads, and much of the way led over frozen lakes and along streams. To face the blizzards of that country alone, at that time, required the courage of a seasoned pioneer. Hill didn't much like the looks of his companion. After a week out, when the fellow suggested their heading for Lake Superior and dividing their cargo, Hill became alarmed. The man was persistent and inclined to be quarrelsome. Each man had a knife and a rifle. Hill waited until they reached a high ridge. The snow lay dazzling white as far as the eye could reach. The nearest habitation was 50 miles away. Under pretense of fixing the harness on his dogs, Jim got about 40 feet from this man, quickly cocked his rifle, and got a bead on the half-bead before the fellow knew what was up. At the word of command, the rogue dropped his rifle and held up his hands. The next order was to right about face. March! The order was obeyed. A double quick was ordered, and the half-breed lit out, quickening his pace as he got out of range. Hill then picked up the other rifle, put whip to his dogs, and by night had gone so far that he could not be overtaken. When Jim came back that way a few weeks later, he kept his eye peeled for danger, but he never saw his friend again. When I heard Mr. Hill relate this story, he told it as simply as he might relate how he went out to milk the cows. One of the men present asked, "Didn't you feel sorry for the fellow, to turn him adrift on that frozen plain without food or fuel?" Mr. Hill hesitated, and then slowly answered, "I thought of that, but preferred to send him adrift rather than kill him, or let him kill me. Anyway, he had only some 50 miles to travel to strike an Indian village. When he was there, we were 150 miles apart. You see, I am a mathematician. It is a great joy to figure out what a long distance you are from some folks." End of section 22.
Section 23 of Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Businessmen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by eamonma. Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Businessmen by Elbert Hubbard. Section 23. James J. Hill, Part 2. In his business of supplying cordwood to steamboats, Mr. Hill had a partner, grizzled and gray, by the name of Griggs. Griggs was a typical pioneer. He was always moving on. He bought a little stern-wheel steamboat, and shipped its boiler and engine across to Breckenridge, where he had the joy of running the first steamboat, the Northwest, on the Red River. Mr. Hill built the second steamboat on the Red River, the Swallow, on the order of Kitson, who bought the boat as soon as she had shown her ability to run. All the metal used in its making, which of course included engine and boiler, was sent across from St. Paul, and if the outfit was gotten out of a wrecked Mississippi sternwheeler, what boots it? Then it was that Kitson, having also bought the Grigg steamboat, was given the title of Commodore, a distinction which he carried through life. By this time several things had happened. One was that Hill had brought up to St. Paul a steamboat load of coal. This coal was mined near Peoria, on the Illinois River, floated down to Mississippi, then carried up to St. Paul. To bring coal to this new castle of wood was regarded as deliberate folly. By this time the St. Paul and Pacific had gotten a track laid clear through to Breckenridge, so as to connect with Commodore Kitson's steamboats. When Hill first reached St. Paul, there was no agriculture north of that point. The wheat belt still lingered around northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin. The fact that seeds can be acclimated, like men and animals, was still in the ether. The Red River Valley is a wonderfully rich district. Louis Agassiz first mapped it and wrote a most interesting essay on it. Here was a wonderful prehistoric lake, draining to the south through the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers, and thence to the Gulf of Mexico. By a volcanic rise of the land on the southern end, centuries ago the current was turned and ran north, making what we call the Red River, emptying into Lake Winnipeg, which in turn has an outlet into Hudson Bay. Agassiz came up the Mississippi River on a trip in 1865. The boat he traveled on was one for which James J. Hill was agent. Naturally, it devolved on Hill to show the visitors the sights thereabouts, and among these sights happened to be our friend Kitson, who, full of enthusiasm, offered to pilot the party across to the Red River. They accepted and ascended to Fort Garry. Agassiz, full of scientific enthusiasm, wrote out his theory about the prehistoric lake, and science, now the world over, calls the Red River Valley Lake Agassiz. With Louis Agassiz was his son Alexander, a fine young man with a pedagogic bent, headed for his father's place as curator of the museum at Harvard. From Winnipeg the party was supplied an Indian guide, who took them across to Lake Superior. Then it was that Alexander Agassiz saw the wonders of Lake Superior copper and Lake Superior iron, and Harvard lost a professor, but the world gained a multimillionaire. Louis Agassiz had no time to make money, but his son Alexander was not thus handicapped. The report of Agassiz on the mineral wealth of Lake Superior corroborated Mr. Hill's own opinions of this country, which he had traversed with dog sleds. Money was scarce, but he, even then, made a small investment in Lake Superior mineral lands, and has been increasing it practically ever since. A recent present to the stockholders of the Great Northern, of an iron tract worth many millions of dollars, had its germ in that memorable day when James J. Hill met the Agassiz party on the levee in St. Paul, and unconsciously changed their route as planned. Mr. Hill's experience would seem to prove that life after all is a sequence, and the man who does great work has long been in training for it. There are two ways for a traveling man to make money. One is to sell the goods, and the other is to work the expense account. There are two ways to make money by managing a railroad. One is through service to the people along the line of the road. The other is through working the bondholders. It was the eventful year of 1876, before James J. Hill really got up steam. He was then 38 years old. He was agent for the St. Paul and Pacific, and in this capacity he had seen that the road was being run with the idea of making money by milking the bondholders. The line had been pushed just as long as the bondholders of Holland would put up the money. To keep things going, interest had been paid to the worthy Dutch, out of the money they had supplied. Gradually, the phlegmatic ones grew wise, and the purse strings of the Netherlands were drawn tight. For hundreds of years Holland had sought a quick northwest passage to India. Little did she know she was now warm on the trail. Little, also, did Jim Hill know. The equipment, engines and cars, was borrowed, so when the receiver was appointed he found only the classic streak of rust and right-of-way. No doubt both of these would have been hypothecated if it were possible. Mr. Hill knew the Northwest as no other man did, except, possibly, Norman Kitson. He had traversed the country from St. Paul to Winnipeg on foot, by ox carts, on horseback, by dog sledges. He had seen it in all seasons and under all conditions. He knew the Red River Valley would raise wheat, and he knew that the prosperity of old Louis Agassiz meant the prosperity of the railroad that ran between that rich valley and St. Anthony's Falls, where the great flouring mills were situated, the center of the flour zone having been shifted from Rochester, New York, to Minneapolis, Minnesota. To gain possession of the railroad and run it so as to build up the country, and thus prosper as the farmers prospered, was his ambition. He was a farmer by prenatal tendency and by education, a commission man by chance, and a master of transportation by instinct. Every farmer should be interested in good roads, for his problem is quite as much to get his products to market as to raise them. Jim Hill focused on getting farm products to market. While he was a Canadian by birth, he had now become a citizen of the United States. His old friend, Commodore Kitson, was a Canadian by birth, and never got beyond taking out his first papers. The Winnipeg agent of the Hudson Bay Company was Donald Alexander Smith, a hearty Scotch burr of a man, with many strong and sturdy oatmeal virtues. He had gone with the Hudson Bay Company as a laborer, became a guide, a trader, and then an agent. Hill and Kitson laid before Smith a plan, very plain, very simple. Buy up the bonds of the St. Paul and Pacific from the Dutch bondholders, foreclose, and own the railroad. Now, Donald A. Smith's connection with the Hudson Bay Company gave him a standing in Montreal banking circles, and to be trusted by Montreal is to have the ear of London. Donald A. Smith went down to Montreal and laid the plan before George Stephen, manager of the Bank of Montreal. If the Bank of Montreal endorsed a financial scheme, it was a go. Only one thing seemed to lie in the way: the willingness of the bondholders to sell out at a figure which our four Canadians could pay. Mr. Hill was for going to Holland and interviewing the bondholders personally. Stephen, more astute in big finance, said, "Bring them over here." Hill could not fetch them. Kitson couldn't, and Donald A. Smith couldn't, because there was no dog sled line to Amsterdam. The Bank of Montreal did the trick, and a committee of Dutchmen arrived to look over their Minnesota holdings with a view of selling out. Mr. Hill took them over the line, a dreary waste of slashings, then a wide expanse of prairie broken now and again by scrub oak and hazel groves, deep gullies here and there, swamps, sloughs, and ponds, with assets of brant, wild geese, ducks, and sandhill cranes. The road was in bad shape, the equipment worse. An inventory of the actual property was taken with the help of the Dutch committee. The visiting Hollanders made a report to the bondholders, advising sale of the bonds at an average of about 40% of their face value, which is what the inventory showed. Our Canadian friends secured an option which gave them time to turn. Farley, the receiver, was willing. The road was reorganized as the St. Paul, Minneapolis and Manitoba Railroad. George Stephen was president, Norman Kitson, first vice president, Donald A. Smith, second vice president, and James J. Hill, general manager. And on Mr. Hill fell the burden of turning a losing property into a prosperous and paying one. From the very day that he became manager, he breathed into the business the breath of life. He sent over to England and bought hundreds of young Hereford bulls, and distributed them along the line of the road among the farmers. Jim Hill's bulls are pointed out now over 3,000 miles of range, and jokes on how Hill bulled the market are always in order. Clydesdale horses were sent out on low prices and long-time payments. Farm seeds, implements, and lumber were put within the reach of any man who really wanted to get on, and lo, the land prospered. The waste places were made green, and the desert blossomed like the rose. The financial blizzard of the year 1873 was, without doubt, an important factor in letting down the bars, so that James J. Hill could come to the front. The river valley, at that time, was not shipping a bushel of wheat. The settlers were just taking care of their own wants, and were feeding the Lady of the Snows up north around Winnipeg. We now know that the snows of the Lady of the Snows are mostly mythical. She is supplying her own food, and we are looking toward her with envious eyes. In the year 1909, The two Dakotas and Minnesotas produce more than 200 million bushels of wheat, worth, say, $1 a bushel. And when wheat is $1 a bushel, the farmers are buying pianolas. The Jim Hill country east of the Rockies is producing easily more than $500 million a year in food products that are sent to the east for market. The first time I saw Mr. Hill was in 1880. He was surely a dynamo of nervous energy. His full beard was tinged with gray. His hair was worn long, and he looked like a successful ranchman with an Omar Khayyam bias. That he hasn't painted pictures like Sir William Van Horn, and thus put that worthy to shame, is to me a marvel. Hill has been an educator of men. He even supplied Donald A. Smith a few business thrills. "Tomorrow night I intend to entertain the governor," once said Smith to Hill. "Tomorrow night you will be on the way to Europe to borrow money from me," said Hill. And it was so. First and foremost, James J. Hill is a farmer. He thinks of himself as following a plow, milking cows, salting steers, shoveling out ear corn for the pigs. He can lift his voice and call the cattle from a mile away, and does at times. He bought a section of Red River Railroad land from himself and put it in his wife's name. The land was swampy, covered with swale, and the settlers had all passed it up as worthless. Mr. Hill cut the swale, tiled the land, and grew a crop that put the farmers to shame. He then started a tile factory in the vicinity and sold it to the managers, two young fellows from the East, as soon as they proved that they had the mental phosphorus and the commercial jamaki. The agricultural schools have always interested Mr. Hill. That which brings a practical return and makes men self-supporting and self-reliant is his eternal hobby. 4 years in college is to him too much. You can get what you want in a year, or not at all, he says. He has sent hundreds of farmers' boys to the agriculture colleges for short terms. Imagine what this means to boys who have been born on the farm and have never been off it. To get the stimulus of travel, lectures, books, and new sights and scenes. In this work, often the boys did not know who the benefactor was. The money was supplied by some man in the nearby town. That was all. These boys, inoculated at Mr. Hill's expense with the education microbe, have often been a civilizing leaven in new communities in the Dakotas, Montana, and Washington. In 1888, the St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Manitoba became a part of the Great Northern. Hill had reached out beyond the wheat country into the arid zone, which was found to be not nearly so arid as we thought. The Black Angus and the white-faced Herefords followed, and where once were only scattering droves of skinny pintos, now were to be seen shaggy-legged Shire horses and dappled Percherons. The bicycle had come, and also the trolley car, and Calamity Jake prophesied that horses would soon be valuable, only for feeding Frenchmen. But Jacob was wrong. Good horses steadily increased in value, and today, in spite of automobiles and airplanes, the prices of horses have aviated. Jim Hill's railroads last year hauled over 300,000 horses out of Montana to the eastern states. The clothes that a man wears, the house that he builds for his family, and the furnishings that he places therein, are all an index of his character. Mr. Hill's mansion on Summit Avenue, St. Paul, was built to last 1,000 years. The bronze girder that supports the staircase is strong enough to hold up a locomotive. The house is nearly 200 feet long, but looks proportionate, from the art gallery, with its fine pictures and pipe organ at one end, to its rich leather-finished dining room at the other. It is of brownstone, the real Fifth Avenue stuff. Fond du Lac stone is cheaper and perhaps just as good, but it has the objectionable light-colored spots. Nothing but the best will do for Hill. The tallest flagpole that can pass the curves of the mountains between Puget Sound and St. Paul graces the yard. The kitchen is lined with glazed brick, so that a hose could be turned on the walls. The laundry room has immense drawers for indoor drying of clothes, no need to open a single window for ventilation, as air from above is forced inside over ice chambers in summer and over hot water pipes in winter. Mr. Hill is a rare judge of art, and has the best collection of Barbizons in America. Anyone can get from his private secretary, J. Toomey, a card of admission. As early as 1881, Mr. Hill had in his modest home on 9th Street, St. Paul, several Carreaus. Mr. Hill is fond of good horses, and has 100 or so of them on his farm of 3,000 acres, 10 miles north of St. Paul. Some years ago, while president of the Great Northern Railway, he drove night and morning in summertime to and from his farm to his office. He very often walks to his house on Summit Avenue, or takes a streetcar. He is thoroughly democratic, and may be seen almost any day walking from the Great Northern Railway office, engaged in conversation with one or more, and no matter how deeply engrossed or how important the subject in hand, he never fails to greet with a nod or a smile an acquaintance. He knows everybody and sees everything. Mr. Hill knows more about farming than any other man I ever met. He raises hogs and cattle, has taken prizes for fat cattle at the Chicago show, and knows more than anybody else today as to the food supply of the world. Yes, and of the coal and timber supply too. He has formed public opinion on these matters, and others, by his able contributions to various magazines. Seattle has erected a monument to James J. Hill, and St. Paul and Minneapolis will, I know, ere long be only too glad to do something in the same line, only greater. Just how any man will act under excitement is an unknown quantity. When the Omaha Railway General Offices in St. Paul took fire, at the first alarm, E.W. Winter, then general manager, ran for the stairway, emerging on the street. Then he bawled up to his clerk on the second floor excitedly, "Charlie, bring down my hat." But his clerk, young Fuller, with more presence of mind, was then at the telephone sending in word to the fire department. Everybody got out safely, but the building was destroyed. One night about 10 o'clock, the St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Manitoba Railway offices at St. Paul caught fire. The smoke penetrated the room where Mr. Hill, with his secretary, Will Steffens, was doing some work after all others had departed. They had paid no attention to the alarm of fire, but the smell of smoke started them into action. Young Steffens hurriedly carried valued books and papers to the vault, while Mr. Hill, with the strength of a giant, grasped a heavy roll-top desk used by A.H. Bode, controller, pushed it to the wall, and threw it bodily out of the second-story window. The desk was shattered to fragments, and the hoodlums grabbed on to the contents. No harm was done to the railway office, save discoloring the edges of some documents. The next morning, when Bode, all unconscious of fire or accident, came to work, Edward Sawyer, the treasurer, said jokingly, "Bode, you may consider yourself discharged, for your desk is in the street." When conductor McMillan sold his farm in the valley for $10,000, he asked Mr. Hill what he should do with the money. "Buy Northern securities," was the answer. He did so and saw them jump 1/3. Frank Moffat was Mr. Hill's secretary for some years. Frank now has charge of the Peavy estate. C.D. Bentley, now a prominent insurance man of St. Paul, a friend of Frank's, used to visit him in Mr. Hill's private office. Mr. Hill caught him there once and said, "Young man, if I catch you here again, I'll throw you out of the window." Bentley thought he meant it, so he kept away in the future. He told the story once in my presence, when Mr. Hill was also present. Mr. Hill bought red lemonade for the bunch. A porter on his private car was foolish enough to ask him at Chicago once at what hour the train returned. That porter had all day to look for another job, and Mr. Hill's secretary provided another porter at once. Mr. Hill cannot overlook incompetency or neglect. Colonel Clough engineered Northern Securities. M.D. Grover, attorney for the Great Northern Railway, said it would not work. Grover was the brightest attorney the road ever had. When the scheme failed, Grover never once said, "I told you so," and Mr. Hill sent him a check for $1,000, over and above his salary. Colonel Clough was employed at a salary of $15,000, some years before his real work began. He came from the Northern Pacific. Mr. Hill, when asked by a leading official of that road what he thought of the colonel, replied, "He's a good man to file contracts." Mr. Hill said of Allen Manville, then general manager of his road, "He may make a man some day." Mr. Hill grew faster than any man about him. He distanced them all. S.S. Breed was treasurer of the old St. Paul and Pacific Railroad. His signature in a bold, fine hand adorned all the bonds of that road, held mostly by the Dutch. He was made auditor when the St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Manitoba Railway was formed. Breed had reached his point of greatest efficiency, but that did not suffice Mr. Hill, who said to him more than once, for Breed was an old-timer and well-liked, "If you can't do the work, I'll have to get someone who can." Mr. Hill, however, neither fired the old man nor reduced his pay. Breed got work up to his death in the Great Northern Railway office, but at the last he served as a guide for strangers. Breed was supplanted by Bode as controller, followed by C.H. Warren, and then by Farrington, all three big boys. About 1889, Mr. Hill gave an address at a banquet in the Merchants' Hotel, St. Paul. With a large map of the United States and Canada on the wall, he took a huge pair of dividers, or compasses, and putting one leg of the dividers on the map at St. Paul, he swung the other leg out southeast 1,500 miles as the crow flies, into the ocean off the Carolina coast. Then with St. Paul still as a center, he swung the compasses around to the northwest 1,500 miles. All this country, he said, is within the wheat belt. The leg of the compasses went beyond Edmonton and Alberta. Last year, this new Canadian country produced more than 100 million bushels of wheat, and this is only the beginning. Mr. Hill has always maintained that to call cotton king is a misnomer. Cotton never was king. Wheat is king, for food is more important than raiment. Wheat is the natural food of man. The civilization of ancient Greece was built upon the Nile Valley wheat. It is the one complete, perfect vegetable food. It contains all the elements necessary to the making of the human body. The supply of wheat is the arterial blood that makes this world of ours do something. Without wheat we would languish, go quickly to seed as China has. St. Paul and Minneapolis lie at the head of navigation on the Mississippi River, a little less than 2,000 miles by water from the Gulf, and about the same distance from Puget Sound tidewater by rail. These cities are in the middle of the wheat belt. To this point came Mr. Hill, a green country youth. Transportation was his theme, and transportation of wheat has been the foundation of his success. Wheat is of more importance to us than anything else, than gold or cotton, or coal or timber or iron. Mr. Hill carries all these over his railroads. The Great Northern Railway, the Northern Pacific, and the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy. Over 20,000 miles of track are in the hollow of his hand. He directs, controls, even to minute details, this great transportation system. His 75th birthday was celebrated a year ago last September. Still, he fails not. He has given up the presidency of the Great Northern Railway, retaining, however, the title Chairman of the Board. But we all know that his hand is felt just the same in every part of the working of these miles of track. Rare ripes rot, but the man who comes into his own late in life has a sense of values and trains on. Mr. Hill does not ask for taffy on a stick, and while he prizes friendship, the hate or praise of those for whose opinions he has little respect are to him as naught. No one need burn the social incense before him in a warm desire to reach his Wolitowski. He judges quickly, and his decisions are usually right and just. It isn't time yet to write his biography. Too many men are alive who have been moved, pushed, and gently jostled out of the way by him, as he forged to the front. Perspective is required in order to get rid of prejudice, but the work of James J. Hill is dedicated to time, and Cleo will eventually write his name high on her roster as a great modern prophet, a creator, a builder. Pericles built the city, but this man made an empire. Smiling farms, thriving schools, busy factories, and happy homes sprang into being in the sunlight of prosperity which he made possible, and as yet the wealth of the hill country is practically untapped. So here endeth Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Businessmen, being volume 11 of the series, as written by Elbert Hubbard, edited and arranged by Fred Bann, borders and initials by Roycroft Artists, and produced by the Roycrofters, at their shops, which are in East Aurora, Erie County, New York, 1922. End of section 23. End of Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Businessmen by Elbert Hubbard.